Chapter 1236. Feng Ling was used to keeping silent about her own thoughts, especially the things she did not want to mention, so she did not continue to talk about this matter. After a moment of silence, she suddenly glanced at him and said, "So you married a 1-year-old baby's cenotaph. What do you say?" Li Nanheng raised his brows. "N." Feng Ling also raised her brows coldly. "You married my cenotaph? Are you bullying a baby who died early for not being able to speak? Did you get my permission to marry me? Do you mean that I have to propose to you?" Seeing that the little woman was really going to settle the score with him, Li Nanheng quickly held her in his arms. The Feng family and the Li family have an engagement. In the beginning, they did force Feng Mingzhu into my hands, but at that time, I was already dead set on wanting you. I definitely wouldn't want her. However, the engagement was still based on the power of the two families. In addition, I once blurted out the matter of the cenotaph. I had already been kidnapped by morality, and I couldn't get rid of it. However, I couldn't really marry another woman behind your back. The best way to compromise was to marry the cenotaph of the Feng family's second daughter. This so-called marriage was actually just writing the second daughter's name into the Li family's ancestral hall in name. There was no actual marriage process. As you can imagine, it was just a few pieces of children's clothes. "If I had known that the owner of those clothes was you," Li Nanheng said as he leaned down and kissed her ear. 3 years ago, I should have given you a nuptial chamber." Feng Ling turned to look at him because of his shameless words, but the man took the opportunity to bite her lips again. He did not bite hard, but his eyes were full of smiles. "Although it was delayed for 3 years, it's not bad. After all, 3 years ago you were still young. Even if I had to hold it in, I couldn't bear to really sleep with you." Feng Ling smiled insincerely. "You slept with me even earlier than 3 years ago. How can you say this?" Li Nanheng pressed his lips against hers and said vaguely, "That's because Fatai forced me to drink, so I'm not sober. If I want to sleep with you, I will definitely do it openly. Do I need to drink?" As he spoke, he tangled his tongue with hers and said hoarsely, "If it weren't for your young age, I'm afraid you would have been executed by me before you even reached the age of 17. All my patience in this life is on you alone. Are you blind or slow to react?" Feng Ling thought that was why he had already done this, and that in his mind, when she was only a teenager, that was why every time she was on the training ground, he would always think of shameless things in his heart. She bit the man, but Li Nanheng smiled and pecked her lips. He touched her head. "Little wife, you are my wife. Be gentle." Another month passed. During this month, Feng Ling still didn't mention the Feng family or her background. She didn't know if anyone had come to look for her. Anyway, if she didn't want to see them, no one could break into the base. She put all her efforts on the newcomers of Team 1. After another month of intensive training and intensive actual combat exercises, this group of newcomers finally fully entered the state of mind. In the second assessment, they all showed good results. 13 of the 20 people were officially accepted into the base, and the remaining people were given a third assessment opportunity for the first time. After finishing this task, Feng Ling did not tell anyone. She wrote 2 emails overnight, one to the base hall, and the other to Li Nanheng's email. Then she left the base before dawn. The next day, when Ah Feng received Feng Ling's leave letter in the base hall, he was a little confused. Why did this person suddenly say that she wanted to take a leave of absence for a few months? Furthermore, she left without saying goodbye. Li Nanheng also saw Feng Ling's email the next day. There was only a simple paragraph. "Boss, the newcomer training mission has been completed. I need time alone to sort out my life. It's rare for me to go out and relax. Don't worry, I'm in good condition. I just want to take a leave. Don't worry." Feng Ling's sudden disappearance made many people in the base confused, but when everyone was curious, Boss Li didn't say that he was looking for her, nor did he show any displeasure about Feng Ling's disappearance. He was so calm as if Feng Ling didn't leave at all, or as if Feng Ling would come back soon, and there was no need to worry at all. Boss Li did not mention anything, nor did he say that he would send someone out to search for her. So Ah Feng and the others could only give up. 4 months later, in the jungle near Malibu Beach, Los Angeles. In the cave, There were several wolf bones that had been weathered to the point that they could not be seen clearly. It had just rained outside the cave, but the leaves above the jungle were too dense. Even though it was raining heavily, only a few raindrops fell into the jungle. Outside the cave, there was a fresh smell of rain. It was damp, but it was clean and pleasant. It was the kind of cleanliness that couldn't be smelled in the hustle and bustle of the city. It was very warm inside the cave. It was spring and summer, so it wasn't very cold. It was raining outside, but there was a fire inside the cave. There were a few dry branches that were picked up a long time ago, on top of a few charcoal stones. There were also a few pots and pans that had been washed very clean on the side. The water in the pot was boiling. Next to it was a flat stone platform about 2 meters long with a simple bedding. This was Feng Ling's bed. It was still raining outside. Feng Ling got up and moved her arms casually. She walked over and used a long stick to gently poke at the fire that was about to be extinguished. She then added a few pieces of dry wood into it. In just a few seconds, the fire burned brighter. This was already the 3rd month she had lived in this jungle. In the 1st month after leaving the base, she really walked around and took the time to see Jin Wan a few times. Later, Jin Wan and the others returned to China, and Feng Ling did not see her again. Later, she returned to the jungle where she had lived before she was 5 years old. It was just that the pack of wolves here had been driven away by the intruders, and the remaining ones had either died or disappeared in the past 20 years, so the cave had long been empty. She was fiddling with the firewood and listening to the rain outside. Suddenly, she seemed to hear something. It sounded like someone's footsteps stepping on the grass nearby. She had been here for a few months and had not seen anyone. She was not sure if it was someone or some kind of animal in the forest that was approaching. When someone walked into the cave, she turned her eyes and saw a tall man casually throw the black travel bag in his hand onto the ground. The man's body was wet and cold. He raised his cold eyebrows and looked at her. "Little wife, can you sleep on this stone bed for 2 people?" Chapter 1237. The person she hadn't seen for 4 months suddenly appeared, and even appeared here. Feng Ling couldn't figure out how he knew she was here. Although she had her cell phone with her, she hadn't charged it for a long time. She lived like a savage here all day. But after all, she had lived here when she was a child. So even if it was boring all day, she could still bear it. Originally, she came out to let herself go and do whatever was comfortable. But her cell phone was not turned on, and there was no GPS location. How did he guess that she was here? Li Nanheng was wearing a simple raincoat from 11 base. But this jungle was very big. He couldn't drive in. After walking for so long, his body was already wet. His head without a rain hat was wet, and his short black hair was dripping with water. However, his eyes were deep and bright as he looked at her. He looked at the little woman who was squatting by the fire, holding a wooden stick in one hand, and looking at him in confusion. After a long while, Feng Ling blinked and looked at him. Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows. "You don't welcome me? Why?" She wanted to ask him how he found her, but after thinking about it carefully, Li Nanheng seemed to know more about her than she knew. Thus, she paused halfway through her sentence. She remained squatting by the fire and watched him. When the man approached her on the dusty ground of the cave, she couldn't help but raise her head to look at the tall man. Then she suddenly retracted her gaze and looked at the black travel bag he had thrown there. "I've been walking for the whole morning. I'm hungry. Is there anything to eat?" After not seeing each other for a few months, Li Nanheng was not unfamiliar with it. He casually unzipped his raincoat and placed it on the temporary wooden rack Feng Ling had placed by the side. He squatted down like her and reached out to warm himself by the fire, as if he wanted to roast away the moisture on his body. Feng Ling looked at him again. Feng Ling looked at him again. It had been several months since he had spoken a word. For a moment, it was as though he could not speak. However, seeing that he was completely unaffected and watching him squatting by the fire, she stiffly and awkwardly pulled the stick back from the fire. Then she pointed the stick at the wild vegetables and fruits piled up in the corner behind her, as well as a wild rabbit. She poked the side again and pointed at the roasted earthworm she had hidden and was reluctant to eat. Looking at those things, Li Nanheng didn't show any signs of discomfort. Instead, he sat on the ground. Sure. They're all good things. You can't even eat roasted earthworms outside. How would these Americans know how high the protein content in earthworms is? Fengling looked at him for a long time and finally found something to say. Li Nanheng, you left 11 base and came here with a travel bag to eat earthworms with me? Are you crazy? The man raised his hand and confidently fiddled with his short hair that had been drenched by the rain. His voice was low and comfortable. I've waited for 4 months. If I don't go back, I can only accompany you. All right, don't talk so much nonsense. I'm hungry. Hurry up and get me something to eat. As he spoke, he glanced at the fire again. How do you cook with this? Can you control the fire well? Fengling was expressionless. I can't say for sure, but at least I haven't starved to death here. What Li Nanheng was most satisfied with was that although she had lived alone in the jungle for several months, she had indeed kept herself fair and clean. She didn't lose any weight, and even seemed to have gained a little weight. However, she had been very thin in the past. This so-called fat was still very thin, but at least the little dimples at the corner of her lips were much more obvious. All right then, do as you see fit. I'll eat whatever you cook. Fengling glanced at him again. He was already here. It wasn't right for her to chase him out now. Besides, it was still raining outside. She could only pour the water in the pot into another clean pot by the side, and get up to pick up the wild vegetables to wash. Since Li Nanheng wanted to eat the roasted earthworms first, she would grant him his wish. In fact, this thing was really delicious. When she was young, she had eaten roasted dragonflies and found them delicious. She just didn't know if Li Nanheng could enjoy the delicacy of these insects. When she got up, she looked at the duffel bag he brought and asked, Are you going to bring me a bunch of barbecue or something to eat like what you did at Rogers Pass? No. Li Nanheng sat there and continued to warm himself by the fire. He said leisurely, You insist on going back to the jungle to experience primitive life, and use this method to calm your heart. I can't disrupt your plan. The bag is filled with my clothes and some tools. Tools? What tool? Fengling wasn't particularly curious. Without waiting for him to answer, she continued to prepare the food. Li Nanheng didn't answer. He just looked at the cave she lived in, and then at the stone platform that was about 2 meters long and 1 meter wide. It was long enough, but not wide enough. After looking at it for a while, he said, If 2 people sleep on this stone bed, I'm afraid they can only hug each other to sleep. Fengling. She turned her head and glared at him. Just come over and take a look. I'll go back sooner or later. Do you really want to live here? Why can't you live here? Don't you care about 11 base? Of course, but my wife is here. I can't leave my wife alone. I don't care. After not seeing him for several months, Fengling was a little embarrassed. Li Nanheng could tell that even when she got up to leave, she still kept a distance from him. He just smiled but raised his eyebrows because of her words. Fengling also realized that she had admitted that she was his wife, so she immediately shut her mouth and didn't speak anymore. When she squatted down to prepare the roasted earthworms, her movements were a little angry. These were the roasted earthworms that she had saved up with great difficulty over the past few months. It was especially difficult to dig them out, and it was more difficult than hunting other wild animals. However, he actually wanted to eat roasted earthworms as soon as he came. He even knew that these things were rich in protein. As expected of the young master of the Li family, he always picked good things. As she busied herself, she felt that this world that belonged to her had suddenly been invaded by a man who had been running amok ever since he entered her life, making her heart restless. Right now she was restless, so she simply found a topic. I haven't contacted Mrs. Mo recently. I don't know how she is now. She went to England. Fengling paused and turned to look at him as if she didn't understand. Chapter 1238. Take care of yourself first. Li Nanheng didn't say much, and only reminded her. Fengling paused. Only then did she see that her hand almost touched the pot of boiling water. She quickly raised her hand, and thought for a moment. She didn't say anything else, and turned to continue working. However, she really didn't expect Jinwan to go to England. When she was still in contact with Jinwan, She only knew that she had returned to China with Mr. Mo. She didn't know what happened to Mr. Mo after he woke up in the hospital. He seemed to have mentioned divorce. At that time, Jinwan was haggard. Feng Ling originally planned to go to High City to accompany her, but Xiao Ba and Xia Tian said it was okay. They would accompany Jinwan and let Feng Ling do what she needed to do in America. If there was no need to go to High City. After confirming that Jinwan was fine, Feng Ling returned to the jungle. After living here for a few months, she didn't expect Jinwan to go to England. It seemed that she should find time to charge her phone and ask High City what was going on. She was busy making food for Li Nanheng. After roasting by the fire for a while, the man stood up, walked a few steps in her small cave, walked to her stone bed, and touched the thin, simple bedding on it. The height of this cave was not suitable for him. In the past, when the wolves lived here, no matter how tall they were, they wouldn't be as tall as a human, especially not as tall as Li Nanheng. Although the space was large enough, compared to the houses in the city, this cave was at least 60 square meters in size. However, the height was a little low, so when the man stood up and walked in, it was even lower. He needed to lower his head slightly when he entered. Seeing that Li Nanheng was only sizing up everything in her cave, Feng Ling didn't say much. Anyway, she didn't have anything else. Leaning against the stone bed, there was a duffel bag near the inner side. It was her own, and there were only a few pieces of clothes in it. Recently, her clothes had been washed in a clear stream in the nearby jungle. She usually washed and bathed there. After all, there was no one here, and she wasn't afraid of being seen. When she was young, she had been there. Now, she occasionally went to the clear stream to wash clothes and throw stones. She felt that it was quite interesting. However, Li Nanheng probably couldn't understand this kind of interesting point. After all, these were all tricks she played before she was 5 years old. It was very childish. After she finished roasting the earthworms, she turned around and saw that the man was already sitting on her stone bed. At the same time, he was looking at her. She turned her head and looked at him. "If you're tired, rest for a while. I don't have any staple food here. If you need it, I'll think of something." "No, it's all the same." "Don't. I just ate these things when I was young, so I'm still used to them now. It's enough to taste the freshness. I'm not used to it." As Feng Ling spoke, she rummaged through a small bag by the side and found a bag of noodles. This kind of noodles had been stored for a long time, and generally wouldn't go bad. It would become soft when boiled in water. She took it out and put it into the pot to cook as she said, "Thankfully, I brought some salt and seasonings when I came in. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be able to eat it." Li Nanheng looked at her expression as she squatted by the fire to cook seriously and chuckled. "If you can eat it, I can eat it." Feng Ling glanced at him. "Before I was 5, I could still eat those tasteless things, but after so many years outside, my taste buds have long become normal. So when I came back, I specially brought some seasonings. Otherwise, if it really has no taste, I won't be used to it." Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows and did not say anything more. He just looked at her with a smile. After not seeing her for several months, he finally saw her again. It was as though he didn't need her to do anything at all. He just needed to watch her hugging her knees and squatting there for hundreds of hours. Feng Ling could feel Li Nanheng's gaze. She slightly turned her face away to avoid looking at him, picked up a small wooden stick, and gently poked it a few times in the fire. In the domestic martial arts movies she watched on TV, there were often plots in which the protagonist fell into a big pit or was trapped in a cave. It was also very common to set up a fire in a cave, but in fact, if she really cooked on the fire, the smoke would be very big and fill the entire cave. Feng Ling was afraid of choking Li Nanheng, so when the smoke rose, she quickly picked up the fan and kept fanning the fire toward the entrance of the cave. Watching her meticulous movements, Li Nanheng watched for a while and walked over. While Feng Ling was still fanning the smoke, he suddenly hugged her from behind. Feng Ling's body froze because of the man who suddenly hugged her from behind, and she almost dropped the fan in her hand. When the man hugged her, he bent down and breathed on the sensitive part of her neck. She subconsciously shrank her neck, looked at the fire under her feet, and hurriedly said, "I'll fan it. Otherwise, the cave will be full of smoke." You're very comfortable here. The man only hugged her. He knew that she wouldn't be used to his excessive enthusiasm after not seeing her for several months. So he restrained his urge to strip her naked. He held her ribs obediently and rested his chin on her neck and shoulder. Do you know how I spent the past few months in the base? Feng Ling did not speak, but looked at the fan in her hand. After pursing her lips for a while, she said, I said I'll go back. This sentence seemed to be a promise. She had said it once just now, and now she said it again. In fact, she just wanted to say that she wouldn't be here for too long. There were still many things she cared about in 11 base. And of course, Li Nanheng was the most important. She just wanted to give herself some time. But it seemed that this time was a little too long. A few months had passed in the blink of an eye. She enjoyed the stolen peace here every day, watching the sun rise and set every day, but neglected Li Nanheng's waiting, especially this man. No matter how patient he was with her, if she didn't go back, the limit of his patience should be almost used up. And I know. The man didn't say much because of her words, but still hugged her like this. Feng Ling knew what he meant. She didn't turn back to push him away, but stood there and gently fanned the fan in her hand. After a long while she said, Well, don't you feel that the smoke is very choking? I don't think so. Your adaptability is really strong. Or is your sense of taste failing? I feel very choked, she said as she shook the fan hard. The man pressed against her neck and chuckled softly. It's not failing. I can still smell the fragrance on your body. Feng Ling. She abruptly turned around in his arms, raised the fan in her hand, and patted his head. Let go, the noodles are about to be cooked. Chapter 1239. It can be eaten even if it's cooked. The man did not dislike it at all, but he did let go of her. This kind of smoke needed to be fanned out. It was fine to smell it once or twice, but after a long time, even if it wasn't poisoned by the smoke, it would still cause some harm to the body. Feng Ling still knew how to get the smoke out, which meant that she had been living alone for the past few months. At the very least, she knew how to take care of her body. With both hands free, she quickly squatted down and fanned the fire on the fire. She put the washed wild vegetables and the various bird eggs she had picked up in the jungle into the pot to cook. She also added some seasonings. In less than 2 minutes, the pot of noodles emitted a unique fragrance. Even if they cooked the same noodles, the noodles cooked with a bunch of wild vegetables and a bird's egg in the jungle would definitely taste different from what they usually ate. The taste would be even more delicious. She asked Li Nanheng to eat noodles and roasted earthworms. Seeing that he didn't mind at all, he quickly ate a lot of the roasted earthworms she had hidden, and the noodles in the bowl were also eaten clean by him. Feng Ling fell into deep thought. If this man only missed her and wanted to stay with her for a day or two, it was fine. However, if he really planned to stay with her, how many earthworms would she have to dig, and how many bird eggs would she have to pick up to support him? Would he really force her to climb a tree to dig a bird's nest? Feng Ling went to the stream to wash the tableware and pot, and brought back some water. The stream in the jungle was very clean, but the water flow was a little rapid. Every time it splashed, her pants would be wet. When she returned to the cave, she suddenly saw the man holding her 2 fans by the fire. She didn't know what he was thinking. She glanced at him, and saw that he was sitting there. She guessed that he was tired, so she didn't ask more. She turned to continue packing her things. When she turned back, she saw that the man had tied the handles of the 2 fans together, and then rubbed them back and forth in his palms, fanning them above the fire. Seeing that he was fanning back and forth, the new smoke floating above the fire spread out faster. Feng Ling said, I heard Kay and the others say that men are naturally interested in hands-on operations. Are you trying to make me a manual blower? Li Nanheng did not speak. He was still studying the 2 fans seriously. Seeing that he was focused on the structure of the 2 fans, he was no longer sitting cross-legged like Boss Li in 11 base. Nor was he Mr. Li of the Li Corporation. Instead, he was like a big boy who had released his nature after returning to the forest. Feng Ling's heart suddenly felt as though something soft had been injected into it. After packing up her things, she leaned against the side and watched him. She watched as the man used the ropes, wooden sticks, the daggers she usually sharpened, and the 2 knives she had taken out. He was studying them over and over. After about an hour, the first blower in the cave was successful. The man turned the handle made of a wooden stick behind the small thing he built with a wooden stick. After turning it a few times, the 2 fans fixed inside began to rotate in the direction of the fire regularly. He did not use much strength, and the wind speed of the fan was several times faster than that of a manual fan. The smoke inside soon dissipated. Seeing that his results were not bad, Feng Ling didn't know what she was thinking. She just leaned against the side and looked at his profile. She felt that this place that belonged to her when she was young was suddenly occupied by this man. She picked up a wild fruit, wiped it clean, walked over, and brought it to the man's mouth. The man was still playing with the small blower in his hand. He opened his mouth and took a bite of her hand. Then his brows instantly furrowed, and he abruptly turned to look at her, only to see that Feng Ling was smiling so brightly that her eyes were curved. "Sour, right?" she asked. She did not continue to let him eat. She picked up the wild fruit he had just taken a bite of and placed it by her mouth to take a bite. Even when eating such a sour fruit, she was still smiling as though she was in a good mood. Li Nanheng swallowed the mouthful of fruit in his mouth and raised his sour brows. He put down the thing in his hand and glanced at her loose cotton trousers. "Why are you wet?" It's fine. Usually when I go to the stream, I get splashed with some water. It dries up by the fire." Feng Ling did not mind. After eating the fruit, she clapped her hands and squatted down to pick up the thing he had just made. She shook the simple handle at the back a few times and found that it was really good to use. "Not bad, Boss Li. Your hands-on ability is really strong." Before she could finish speaking, her waist suddenly tightened. The man took advantage of her squatting beside him and pulled her into his arms. Feng Ling lost her balance and fell onto his lap. The man held her shoulder and lowered his head to kiss her ear. He said meaningfully by her ear, "Other than my hands-on ability, I'm also very strong in other aspects. Don't you know that?" Feng Ling. In this forest, this kind of silent and ambiguous atmosphere really made one's heart tremble. It really made one's entire body sensitive. She quickly got up from his arms and squatted back to his side. She calmly fiddled with the newly made Li-style manual blower. Seeing her stern expression, Li Nanheng chuckled and raised his hand. His slender fingers combed the hair by her cheek. Looking at her hair that had grown so long that it was almost close to her neck, because she had not gone out to trim it in time in the past few months, he asked with a smile, "Shy again?" Feng Ling's face was slightly itchy. She raised her hand and slapped his hand away. "Stop fooling around." Feng Ling, who dared to live alone in the jungle for several months, and dared to associate with snakes, insects and beasts, would only show this shy side of a little woman in front of him. Li Nanheng smiled because of her "stop fooling around." He raised his hand and pressed the top of her soft hair as if coaxing a child. 11 Bases goddess of war, Feng Ling, is so thin-skinned. Who would believe it? Feng Ling raised her hand to push his hand away and quickly combed her messy hair back. She then picked up the wooden stick on the ground and poked at the fire in front of her. She was still wondering when this man planned to leave. If she couldn't, she would take advantage of the rain outside to find something to eat. "When are you leaving?" Thinking of this, she asked directly. There was a crackling sound on the fire. Li Nanheng watched her unconsciously poking back and forth. His lips curved slightly, and he reached out to hold her hand that was still holding the wooden stick. "You still want to chase me away? Do you think my skin is as thin as yours? Since I'm already here, how can I leave? Unless you go back, from today onwards, this cave belongs to the Li family." Li era. Dads, please vote. Chapter 1240. With that, the man added, "Like you change your surname to Li." Feng Ling. "When did I change my surname to Li?" Li Nanheng chuckled. "It's a traditional virtue of the Chinese. After the woman marries the man, the surname in front of her name will be the surname of her husband's family. Even in this era, there's no need to write the Li family's surname. Even if you're Chinese, you still have the blood of your ancestors. This is all left behind by your ancestors. Isn't it only a matter of time before your surname is Li? All you need is a formal proposal and marriage process. If you want it, come back to the Li family with me now. I'll satisfy you. There were the most Chinese people in the entire base, and the Li family and Feng family were also Chinese. Although they were in Los Angeles, they usually came into contact with Chinese people. Although Feng Ling didn't know much about this kind of thing, she had a rough idea. Of course, she understood what he meant by changing his surname to Li. Grandfather Li had personally gone to the base to invite her to the Li family as a guest, and had clearly accepted her. She didn't know how long Li Nanheng had been a lobbyist for those old men when he returned home, to make such a stubborn old man personally go to the base to treat her so well in public. In addition, she later learned about the cenotaph. It was really a coincidence. Their fate was already so coincidental, coupled with the fact that their hearts were in each other's hearts. How could she not be willing to marry him? She couldn't shake the man's hand away, so she could only put down the wooden stick and then turn to look at him. The reason why Elderly accepted me is because he already knew that I was the second daughter of the Feng family. He knew that I was the cenotaph he married. Seeing that she had something to say, Li Nanheng raised his good-looking brows and looked at her. Then if I refused to return to the Feng family and refused to accept the identity of the second daughter, will Elderly have any objections? No. At the same time, he tucked the hair sticking to her cheek behind her ear. Looking at her white ear, he touched the soft flesh under her ear. The Li family doesn't have so many complicated thoughts. As long as you break their original stubbornness, they won't care too much about these small details. As long as you give them a great-grandson as soon as possible, he will definitely be the treasure of the new Li family. If anyone dares to touch him, the four old ones will definitely rush out to protect him. Feng Ling, who was able to maintain a serious and calm expression, almost collapsed. Who wants to carry a child? After that, she didn't listen to the man speak again, and suddenly stood up. The rain outside has stopped. I'll go get some wild vegetables and mushrooms, and bring back some edible things. Don't wander around here. If you wander around outside, it's easy to get lost. Li Nanheng glanced at her. I'll get lost. Do you think I'm a 3-year-old? It's really wrong to compare yourself to a 3-year-old. When I was 3 years old, I wouldn't get lost here. Feng Ling muttered again, and then found that she didn't know what she was talking about. When she saw the man sitting on the ground looking at her with a faint smile, she simply stopped talking and turned to walk out. The jungle was very fresh after the rain. Occasionally, there would be some rainwater falling from the top of the dense jungle. It was some rainwater that had accumulated on the leaves, but because it was too dense, there was not much that fell. Feng Ling often came out to pick wild vegetables and find wild fruits. This was her daily routine, but now that Li Nanheng was here, she would deliberately get more. When she walked back with a basket of vegetables, fruits, and a few bird eggs, she vaguely heard some movement in the cave. She subconsciously walked back, but as soon as she approached, she saw that Li Nanheng had cleared the tall grass near a large area outside her cave. He had also flattened the ground and used flat stones to pad the ground, forming a large square ground. It looked as neat and clean as the cobblestone ground that could often be seen in the city. At the same time, she saw that the man had cut down an old tree that had withered for many years not far away. It had only been more than 2 hours, and he had actually broken that withered tree. Feng Ling looked at the neatly broken spot under the old tree in surprise. She then saw that the man had used something to smooth the various wooden boards. She saw that he had piled the wooden boards by the side, and was busy stacking the stones by the side. She seemed to understand something and rushed over. You're not going to help me build a house, are you? The man had been busy for a long time, and his black t-shirt was soaked with sweat. Hearing that she had come back, he simply glanced at the things in the basket in her hand, and then at her. It's not a big project to build a wooden house in such a place. As expected, he was really going to build a house for her. Looking at the large stones that he was embedding into the ground, she realized that he was making a simple foundation. This place was against the mountain wall, and there was usually not much wind, so as long as the foundation was solid, it would be fine. There was no lack of soil, stones, and wood in this kind of place. However, Feng Ling was curious about how Li Nanheng had broken the tree so quickly. She didn't hear any sound of cutting trees, and it seemed that he had made a lot of wooden boards. Although this amount of wooden boards was definitely not enough in such a short period of time, this speed was already very fast. She thought of something, stepped over the pebbles on the ground, and walked into the cave. Sure enough, she saw that the black travel bag he had brought had been opened. Chapter 1241. It seemed that the heavens were not particularly cruel to her fate. Even though she fell into the ocean when she was 1 year old, even though she was a little wolf girl, and had to disguise as a man to survive, even though her life was very hard, fate gave her a Enchanting who could smooth over all her past experiences. She looked at the tools on the ground, and listened to the man patiently building the stones outside. She suddenly dropped the basket in her hand, turned around, and walked out quickly. She rushed behind the man and suddenly hugged him from behind. The man paused and glanced back at her. "What's wrong?" Feng Ling buried her face in his back. She had never been good at expressing herself with words, especially when it came to feelings. When she knew that she really liked him, she chose not to be so passive, and would respond to him. She would try her best to learn to cooperate and not hurt his heart. At this moment, she was overwhelmed with emotions. She didn't know what to say. She just hugged his waist tightly through his sweaty clothes, but she couldn't speak. After being hugged by her for a while, Enchanting suddenly chuckled. He did not push her away, but bent down to pick up the polished stones. He turned his head to look for a suitable place to embed them. At the same time he said, "It's nothing. Don't be too touched. This place is very important to me. I won't destroy it. I'll just connect a wooden house outside this cave, and put it next to the cave inside. At least it's like a home. Even if I leave in the future, if I want to come back to take a look, there'll be a decent place to live." Feng Ling nodded and pressed against his back. After a long while she said, "Do you need any help?" Enchanting suddenly reached under his clothes and decisively took off his sweaty t-shirt. Seeing that the man was suddenly naked, Feng Ling looked at him with a flushed face. She didn't understand what he was doing in broad daylight, but the man just casually threw the clothes into her hands. "Help me wash my clothes and cook. I don't need anything else." "Feng Ling, you really treat me as a woman." Enchanting glanced at her. "Not a woman? In this jungle, guns, sticks, and agility were useless." If it was really talking about building a house, Feng Ling really couldn't help much. Earlier, she had seen the man's ability to do things and build structures. Right now, she seemed to only be able to wash clothes and cook. Why did she suddenly have the feeling that she could plow the fields and weave the cloth? When Feng Ling lived here, she was self-sufficient and felt that she was quite powerful. Now she suddenly changed from an instructor to a woman who washed clothes and cooked. This change made her a little helpless, but when she saw the man's naked upper body and his sweaty back, she was even more helpless. She simply carried his clothes away and quickly to wash them for him. The smell of the man's sweat was not unpleasant at all. The clothes still carried his unique scent and a faint smell of tobacco. However, Feng Ling knew that Enchanting was a germaphobe, so she carefully washed him and hung him on the drying rack that she had temporarily set up with some long wooden sticks in the cave. After all, a house was a big project. No matter how fast she was and how many tools she had, it was impossible to build it in a day. After the stones and foundation outside the cave were laid, the sky was already dark. Enchanting went to the stream to take a shower. After showering, he came back refreshed and relaxed. He was wearing the clothes in his travel bag. They were all simple and loose clothes. If she hadn't seen those tools, Feng Ling would have thought that he had come to the jungle for a vacation. She had already showered and was sitting in the cave to make food. In the past, when she was outside, she rarely had the chance to cook personally, and she didn't know how to cook. There were only a few simple things, but in this jungle, she could only rely on herself for 3 meals a day. She couldn't eat takeout here, so she was used to this. However, with the sudden appearance of a man, it was as if there was something different in the peaceful and unchanging life of the past few months. She didn't know why she was jumping with joy in her heart. She was just very happy. She was just in a good mood. She could clearly feel that she was in a good mood. Also, when she saw that Enchanting had walked back safely after taking a shower, and was sure that he really wouldn't get lost, She smiled and looked at the refreshed man. She placed the dinner she had prepared on the small stone table. "Boss, let's eat." Li Nanheng had already walked over and sat by her side. He took the bowl, picked up the chopsticks, and lowered his head to take a bite. His posture was natural and casual, as though he had not just come from a big city like Los Angeles. Instead, it was as though he had lived in this place with her for many years. This kind of place is indeed suitable for eating and sleeping. It's really quiet. As Li Nanheng spoke, he glanced at the stone foundation outside the cave. "We'll continue tomorrow morning. The wooden planks that a tree can make aren't enough. Are there any other withered trees nearby?" "Yes, there are 2 more about 200 meters away on the other side. There are more nearby." Feng Ling put down the bowl in her hand and looked at him. "It's enough that you want to help me build a house. I appreciate it. There's no need to go through so much trouble." Li Nanheng sneered coldly at her polite words and continued to eat. After eating, he put down the tableware and glanced at her while eating. The light of the fire shone on Feng Ling's face, making her complexion look healthy and rosy. Originally, because they hadn't seen each other for a few months, he wanted to take advantage of the break, to sit by the side, and take a good look at her. However, as he watched her swallow her snow-white neck, the man's eyes gradually became uncontrollably hot. Feng Ling turned to look at him, because of his gaze, and met the man's gradually darkening gaze. She slowly shifted her gaze away, and lowered her head to continue eating, as though she hadn't seen anything. Originally, her eating speed was normal. It was just that compared to the speed at which the man beside her ate, she was a little slower. However, right now, she really slowed down without batting an eyelid. After a while, she finished eating and put down the cutlery. There was nothing left to hold in her hand. After 2 seconds of silence, she said, "I'll go wash the dishes." As she spoke, she was about to put away the cutlery and go out to bring it to the stream. She had just stood up by the fire and was about to take the cutlery out when she suddenly heard the man sitting by the side sigh with a smile. "It's already dark outside. Put it in the water first. It won't be too late to wash it tomorrow morning." Chapter 1242. Not only was it dark, but it also sounded like it was raining outside the cave, but it was not raining heavily. "It's raining. Will there be any problems with those wooden boards being wet?" "There's no problem. At most, there's moisture in the wooden boards. After the house is built, we'll leave it empty for 2 days before living in it. It's not a big problem." Hearing this, Feng Ling did not ask any more. She placed the cutlery in another basin with clear water by the side, washed it simply, and placed it by the side. She planned to take it to the stream tomorrow morning to wash it properly. In the end, when she wiped her hands briefly, she turned back to see that Li Nanheng was still sitting cross-legged there. It seemed that he had not moved for a long time. He was just looking at her, his eyes never leaving her. Feng Ling had seen Li Nanheng many times. She had also seen many different gazes that belonged to him. However, it seemed that every time she saw his gaze, her body would soften. She put away her armor and wanted to take the initiative to approach him. She wanted to hug him with her passion, but she was not good at expressing herself. So every time she almost collapsed under his gaze, she would subconsciously want to divert her attention. However, it wasn't easy for the man to arrange the time and everything. He entered the jungle to find her and accompany her. In this place where there was no signal, even if he wanted to kill time with his phone, he would not give her a chance to divert her attention. When Feng Ling wiped her hands and walked over, he reached out to hold her hand and pulled her. Feng Ling was originally a little on guard and stood steadily. She subconsciously wanted to struggle back, but the man only held her and raised his cold and handsome brows at her. There was a faint smile in his eyes. She paused and relaxed her struggle. However, in this moment of hesitation, the man increased his strength and pulled her over into his arms. Feng Ling hit him hard in his arms and sat on his thigh. The man's lips rubbed against her hairline, and he whispered in her ear, "Why are you hiding, Feng Ling?" "I didn't dodge." At the same time, she turned to look at him, but at this moment, the man planted a kiss between her brows, and then slowly moved down, landing on her eyelids. "I don't know how I survived these past few months. It's good. I'm enjoying a peaceful and happy life outside alone. I said that I would go back soon, but in the end, I haven't been seen for 4 months. I've changed from the mighty boss of 11 base to a wife-waiting stone. If it weren't for the fact that I'm so pitiful, do you think Ah Feng and the others would let me leave the base to look for my wife so easily? Feng Ling pondered, and felt that the reason why Li Nanheng was allowed to take a leave was definitely fake. With Ah Feng's personality, how could he do everything for the Li family and the base so easily? He must have used some other method, but no matter what method he used, he had indeed found this place. She leaned against his arms and did not move. She gently rubbed her head against his shoulder. I'm sorry. I've been living here for the past few months, and I've almost forgotten the time. I only realized that I've been gone for 4 months. Your apology is too insincere. I don't accept it. The man's tone was indifferent, but he did not let go of her hand. Feng Ling realized that this man was actually being arrogant. She immediately raised her eyes to glance at him, only to see that the man was looking down at her. Knowing that he was digging a pit for her to jump into, Feng Ling pretended not to know. Then what do you want? What do I want? The man hugged her waist tightly and pressed her against his chest as if hinting. At the same time, he lowered his head and pressed his forehead against hers. His warm breath pressed against her lips. I want everything. I want this and that. Are you willing? When have you ever cooperated obediently? Feng Ling blinked and did not speak. The man raised his hand to stroke the back of her head and looked deeply into her clear eyes. He was about to kiss her, when she subconsciously shrank her neck back. He did not give her a chance to dodge and decisively pressed the back of her head. In the end, Feng Ling's lips hit his heavily. The man accepted it with a smile and sucked her soft lips. The kiss was relatively calm. It was not the kind of kiss that he could not wait to press her to the ground and strip her naked. Instead, he kissed her patiently and finally kissed the corner of her lips. He stroked her slightly longer hair and pressed against her lips hoarsely. Just like this, take the initiative. When will you learn it? In the beginning, because they hadn't seen each other for several months, Feng Ling subconsciously felt a little embarrassed. Being held in the man's arms and kissed like this, the feelings she had in the past were also stirred up. She looked at him and felt that the man seemed to understand her very well. He was patiently drilling into her heart step by step. Even if he did have the most direct physical desire, he had always respected her when it was time for him to respect her. For example, right now, his eyes were clearly filled with desire, but he only hugged her, kissed her gently, looked at her patiently and talked to her. Seeing that she had been leaning in his arms without saying a word or moving, Li Nanheng stroked her head comfortingly. I walked for a long time in the jungle before coming in. I've been busy with the wood and stones in the afternoon. I'm really tired. Let's sleep. But it's indeed a bit difficult for 2 people to sleep on this stone bed. When the house is built, I'll think of a way to get a bed. With that, he signaled her to lie down on the stone bed with his eyes. Sleep on it. I'll simply spread some hay on the ground by the side and sleep for the night. I see there's hay here. It should be able to be used tomorrow. Before he could finish speaking, Feng Ling, who had been obedient in his arms, suddenly raised her eyes to look at him. Her eyes were bright, and he couldn't tell what she was thinking. Just as Li Nanheng paused for a second because of her gaze, she suddenly raised her hands and wrapped them around his neck. She raised her head and kissed him. First, she kissed the man's firm and handsome chin. Then she moved up and kissed his face. Then she moved to his lips and kissed him without hesitation. After all, she had been kissed by him so many times. No matter what, she had learned some tricks. She carefully used the tip of her tongue to pry open his lips. She felt the man's entire body tremble. The moment his gaze darkened, she hugged his neck tightly and refused to let go. It was as though she had experienced something new. She carefully used the tip of her tongue to gently lick the soft outline of his lips twice. Begging for monthly tickets. Chapter 1243. Although he said that he wanted Feng Ling to take the initiative, once she really took the initiative, even if it was just a kiss, even if it was just a simple tease, it could make the blood of the man who had been maintaining his rationality boil. In the mountains and forests, in the empty cave, There were occasional cries of unknown birds and beasts several miles away. The aura of nature surrounded the vicinity, and there was only a man and a woman hugging each other. The woman he loved the most was in his arms, and she was still so proactive. No one could King stand it. Not to mention Li Nanheng, who had endured for who knew how long. Feng Ling probably only had the courage to take the initiative to kiss him. She didn't know how to proceed to the next step. She kissed the man until his entire body tensed up, and his arms held her tightly like iron pincers. The man took the initiative to kiss her deeply. She had also taken a simple shower by the stream, and the two of them smelled clean and fresh. The crackling sound of the fire by the side was connected to the sound of the rain outside the cave. However, Feng Ling's face had turned warm and looked very soft. Li Nanheng couldn't help but wish he could turn into a beast right now. Feng Ling didn't expect Li Nanheng to be so decisive. By the time she reacted, Li Nanheng had already carried her to the stone bed she had slept on for several months. Although there was a simple layer of bedding on it, there was also hay under the bedding, so it wasn't very hard. When her clothes were almost torn by the man, she quickly raised her hand and said, "Don't, I only brought a few clothes. If I break them, I won't be able to wear them." The man's hands stopped moving, but he switched to other methods of attack. He let go of the buttons on her clothes and turned to kiss her neck passionately. He kissed her until her whole body was numb, and she couldn't stop trembling from the arousal. It wasn't until she unbuttoned the first 2 buttons of her shirt that the man took the opportunity to strip her clothes off. In an instant, she was completely exposed to the air from one shoulder to the back. He looked at her fair shoulder and kissed it. Feng Ling tilted her head slightly. Her eyes were red from the stimulation brought by the man. Her mind kept replaying the scene of herself curled up in this cave when she was 5 years old. At that time, no matter if she was cold or hungry, she could only stay here, waiting for the wolves to come back, or holding her growling stomach in a daze. Time had changed. At that time, she would never have imagined that one day, a man would come to this place because of her. He understood her feelings for this cave. Even if it was in this wild forest, even if it was isolated from the world, even if she chose to return to this kind of peace and never leave, he was willing to stay here with her until the end of time, unwilling to leave. Looking at Feng Ling's expression under him, although she usually wore a calm and plain mask in front of others, she would only release her softness in front of him. She would have such a helpless and seductive look under him. She would support him and rush out of the enemy in times of danger, making him feel endless joy and satisfaction, whether it was when he was sober or in this kind of pleasure. He loved this feeling so much that even his heart trembled. He kissed Feng Ling's sweaty face, from her forehead to the tip of her nose, from her lips to the corner of her mouth. It was as though he was holding his entire world in his arms. He sighed in her ear over and over again. "Feng Ling, I fucking love you so much that I almost forget who I am. You're mine. You're mine for the rest of my life. No matter if you're happy or unhappy, no matter if you're in 11 base or in any corner of the world, you can't push me away. Do you remember?" Feng Ling's face was covered in sweat, and her lips were wet with sweat. Feng Ling couldn't help but snort under the violent impact. She replied unsteadily, "Then what if you push me away?" The man chuckled and suddenly bit her lips hard. "Impossible." Chapter 1244. Even if you put a knife to my neck, I won't let you go. How can I push you away? Li Nanheng tightened his movements as though he was punishing her. Feng Ling's entire body trembled. It was as though a small electric current had passed through her entire body. Her entire body tensed up to the limit. Gently, she tried her best to suppress her voice. You don't." She couldn't hold it in any longer, and her voice turned into a sobbing tone. When the man temporarily ended, but did not intend to completely end it, Feng Ling recalled that the man had taken the initiative. She remembered that he had been rushing on the road today, and had been busy outside, yet he still had such astonishing stamina. She was really impressed. Even though her entire body was numb and sore, and she did not want to move, she still turned over beside the man, her eyes hazy from the tears. Li Nanheng turned to look at her. He had not had enough. He only planned to continue after resting for a few minutes. But when he saw the little woman in his arms and her flushed face, he was so seduced by her gaze that he did not even want to rest for a few minutes. He wanted to continue like this, so he smiled and kissed her cheek. "You make me feel like a hooligan who bullies the weak." Feng Ling glanced at him, and in the next moment, Li Nanhing's brows suddenly twitched. He was speechless because Feng Ling suddenly pushed him down, turned over, and sat on his lower abdomen. She panted and said condescendingly, "I'm not weak." Li Nanhing stared at her in shock, as though he wanted to confirm if Feng Ling, who had learned to take the initiative today, was really her. However, Feng Ling did not give him time to be shocked. She immediately moved back until she found the right position. She looked at him with bright eyes, clearly wanting to prove that she was not weak. She pressed down on him forcefully. She sat down. Everything that night was too crazy. Time seemed to pass especially quickly. By the time the two of them were exhausted and sleepy, the sky outside the jungle had already revealed the light of dawn. After an entire night of rain, there was still some cold air outside. If she went to Qingxi to take a bath at this time, she would definitely catch a cold. The two of them were indeed too tired to move. They couldn't even be bothered to wash up. He bit Feng Ling's ear and asked in a muffled voice, "Shall we shower together after we wake up?" Feng Ling did not answer. She was so tired that she had fallen asleep. In this jungle, there was no need to wake up early for morning training. There was no need to face the rules of time that one had to abide by outside. They could wake up whenever they wanted. The two of them fell asleep in each other's arms. Feng Ling was so tired that she tilted her head in his arms. In the end, Li Nanheng did not sleep on the hay on the ground. Although the stone bed was not wide enough, he could still sleep if he hugged her tightly. He was happy to sleep with her in his arms. Li Nanheng kissed her face again, and fell asleep with satisfaction. For 4 consecutive days, except for being forcefully dragged back to the cave by Feng Ling at night to rest, Li Nanheng barely rested during the day. He had been busy cutting down withered trees and making wooden planks to build the house. 4 days later, the house had already taken shape. The roof had also been built, and several layers of wooden planks had been placed, mainly to prevent rain from leaking. Feng Ling also helped out in the past few days. She couldn't build the house, but she paved the ground between the house and the cave with stones. She then went to the jungle to dig some mud, and mixed the stones with the soil to continue leveling. In the end, when the stones and soil were dry, the ground was like a floor made of pebbles. It was very flat and beautiful, and it gave off a very natural feeling. Feng Ling pulled a long line in the cave behind the house to dry the clothes. Previously, it was just a simple wooden rack. Now she had more space to dry the clothes and place things. Li Nanheng's ability to survive in the wild was really strong. He even used the remaining yellow soil and cut flat stones she dug to build a stove in the cave. This way, when she cooked in the future, she didn't have to use the simple method of roasting on the fire. Instead, she could use the stove to cook. This was more convenient, and there wouldn't be so much smoke. In the past, Feng Ling only wanted to return to this place to live alone and have some peace and quiet. She had never thought of building a house or doing these things here. Li Nanheng's arrival had made a qualitative leap in her life here. The two of them personally built a home with bricks and wood, filling Feng Ling's heart with bricks and wood. Feng Ling stood outside the house and saw that Li Nanheng was reinforcing the windows. She looked at him and said, "You've made this place so good. Even if I want to leave now, I can't bear to leave. What should I do?" Li Nanheng's hands did not stop. He continued to fix the wooden planks on the window and replied, "I'll stay with you as long as you want. Even if I go out in the future, I can accompany you back when I miss this place. You can't bear to part with this place, but can you bear to part with me?" For several days, they lived together from morning to night. They worked together during the day and slept together at night. There was no one else staring at them, and there was no need to be afraid of being shy. Feng Ling also no longer hid her feelings. She directly answered with a smile, "I can't bear to part with you." "That's right." The man nailed the wooden planks to the window frame and patiently hammered the nails as he said, "Wherever I am, that's your home. We can build a house here, and we can also have our own place outside. You can live wherever you like." The important thing is that as long as I'm here, you won't be without a home, understand? A person who had never had a home since she was young watched her own home being built with her own eyes. She heard a man say that wherever he was, that was where her home was. What could be more satisfying than this? After another day, Li Nanheng went to chop trees and cut wooden planks again. Feng Ling helped by the side and asked, "What are you going to do this time? Isn't the house already done?" "Bed," Li Nanheng said concisely. Feng Ling's gaze abruptly fell on the wooden planks in his hand, and the wooden planks piled by his feet. Seeing these wooden planks, she knew that he was going to make a very, very big bed. She couldn't help but laugh. "I thought you enjoyed hugging me to sleep on the stone bed every day." "Yes, I do enjoy it, but it's not a long-term solution." Li Nanheng blew on the freshly cut wooden planks in his hand and said mildly, "That stone is 2 meters long, more than 1 meter wide, and it's not low. No matter how good my physical strength is, I'm not an immortal. Even if there are a few more Li Nanheng, I won't be able to lift it. I have to put a decent bed in this newly built house." Chapter 1245. Feng Ling nodded and felt that what he said made sense. At the same time she asked, "Then what should I do now? There are still a few hours before lunch. There's no need for me to boil water and cook now. Teach me how to use these tools. I'll help you, okay?" Li Nanheng stopped his movements and glanced at her. He saw that Feng Ling was sitting on the small stool made of a few remaining pieces of wood, and looking at him with one hand holding her chin. He sighed with a smile. "I don't need your help. If you really have nothing to do, why don't you dance for me?" "Feng Ling." The man raised his eyebrows. "Why are you looking at me like this?" Feng Ling put down her hand and said with a stern face, "I don't know how to dance." He smiled. "Oh yes, you really don't know. Feng Ling. Then why don't you do a set of boxing, or those basic close combat moves from the base? It looks good when you link them together. Why don't you do it for me?" "No. You know how to do this. Why don't you do it?" "You taught me. In front of you. This is called showing off in front of an expert. If I do something wrong, you'll scold me. I won't do it." Li Nanheng was amused. "I only scolded you when you first came to the base. At that time, your physical strength was indeed inferior to others, and some of your basic movements were not standard. Do you still hold a grudge against me after I taught you a few lessons? I'm telling the truth. You used to scold me a lot." Feng Ling rolled her eyes at him. Li Nanheng chuckled. He liked how she was less and less able to hide her emotions. "Then what should I do? I can't bear this grudge for a lifetime. Why don't I stay down for the next few nights, so that you can suppress my arrogance?" Feng Ling ignored him. She didn't know how to build a house or a bed, but she could make some small stools. She walked over and picked up a few pieces of wood that had been cut off. She found a few pieces that were relatively neat, as though she had found a treasure. She quickly took them to the side and put them together to make some small stools or other simple things. Seeing that she had clearly begun to like making small things in the past few days, and then looking at her carefully studying a few wooden boards, Li Nanheng smiled faintly and continued to do the unfinished work at hand. The amount of work needed to build a bed was definitely not as huge as building a house. The house had to pay attention to all kinds of details, such as waterproof and rainproof. There were also layers of boards inside and outside the house to block the wooden cracks and other auxiliary things. As for the bed, it was relatively faster as long as it was firm and sturdy. After Li Nanheng finished building the bed, he placed it in a suitable position against the wall in the room. Then he noticed that the room probably lacked a set of tables and chairs for eating. This was more or less enough. There was no hurry. Recently, Feng Ling also wanted to make some small things. He could slowly teach her how to make them and accompany her. This way, she could also find some interest. The two of them had lived in the city for many years, in such a quiet life in the jungle where they didn't even need to turn on their phones. They didn't feel bored at all. In fact, they felt that this kind of life was so peaceful that they could let go of all the grudges outside. Feng Ling calmed down and did not mind much about the Feng family and Feng Mingzhu. After all, in the past 20 years, she hadn't had any contact with the Feng family. It seemed that she had nothing to do with that family, except for a blood relationship. Although Feng Mingzhu was extremely selfish and narrow-minded, the elders of the Feng family were not heartless people. In this way, Feng Ling did not have too many complaints, dissatisfaction, or hatred, nor did she have any feelings of being touched or thinking about. If she left the jungle one day and returned to the outside world, Feng Ling would go to the Feng family to take a look. If the Feng family insisted, she would go to the Feng family to take a look and personally remove her mourning haul. She would tell them that she was still alive and thank them for giving birth to her. She would return to the Feng family, but she would only acknowledge them. She would not stay in the Feng family. She would still be the same Feng Ling. If the Feng family chose to be quiet and not disturb her, she would remain silent and not reveal the truth. It would be best to maintain the status quo. Feng Ling knew that no matter how peaceful and happy her life in this jungle was, sooner or later, she would still have to go back. Both of them had things to bear on their shoulders. This kind of peaceful life could only exist in books and stories. In reality, they both had responsibilities to bear. Feng Ling learned things very quickly. Although Li Nanheng had never learned any carpentry, men were all agile and had a natural sensitivity to these things. So he helped her build a house bit by bit. After she learned how to make the wooden boards, she spent a week building tables, chairs, and other small items with him. The wooden house that belonged to them was complete and did not even lack any furniture. After they officially moved in, Feng Ling opened the wooden cabinet in the house, took out a clean set of clothes that belonged to Li Nanheng and walked out. Before she walked to the stream, she heard the sound of water splashing. She craned her neck to look over, only to see Li Nanheng biting a blade of grass in his mouth. The tall and straight man was standing there bare-chested. With one hand, he lifted the flowing water in the clear stream onto his body, while the other hand was on his waist. With the grass in his mouth, he looked like a grandfather who was the king of the forest. There seemed to be something moving around the man's feet. Feng Ling walked over and saw that it was a small wild boar. However, its two front trotters were tied to a rock with a rope, and it was struggling with all its might. She then looked at the man who was standing calmly by the side taking a shower. She didn't even need to think to know that this little wild pig had foolishly bumped into the leather boots of this man. Otherwise, how could he be tied up here so miserably? She walked over with a smile, squatted down, and placed the clothes in her hand on the clean rock by the side. Then she picked up the little wild boar's pair of pig trotters with her hand, and the little thing struggled even more happily. There are quite a few birds and beasts in this jungle every day. We have a good balance of meat and vegetables here. Why did you tie it here? It's too small. If you want to eat it, you have to wait until it grows up. Otherwise, I won't be able to do it, she suddenly said. Both of them came from the base, and their ears had always been sharp. Besides, they had lived here together for so long. Before Feng Ling approached, Li Nanheng heard that it was her. He did not turn back, but stood there and splashed water on his body. Hearing her words, the man looked back at her. If it were any other woman, he would have picked her up and said that he couldn't bear to eat or kill her. However, in her mouth, it became that even if he wanted to eat it, he had to wait until it grew older. Then I'll raise it before eating it. Raise? Who will raise it? You. Feng Ling pointed at herself, and then at the little wild boar on the ground. Li Nanheng, it's enough to raise you. You still want me to raise a pig? Chapter 1246. Li Nanheng, it's enough to raise you alone. Why do you want me to raise a pig? There was nothing wrong with the second half of this sentence, but the first half made Li Nanheng's brows twitch, and he stopped splashing water on his body. Then he suddenly smiled meaningfully and looked at her. Come here. Seeing the man's dangerous smile, Feng Ling's fingers were still hooking the front hooves of the little wild boar. Listening to the little pig's cries, she said firmly and decisively, No. Li Nanheng immediately squinted at her. Feng Ling continued to tease the little wild boar that was already crying anxiously. She was about to untie it when Li Nanheng walked up from the stream. The man's upper body was bare, and the trousers of his trousers were also wet, but it did not affect the man's handsome appearance at all. He walked over and said, If you dare to let her go, if I don't roast it tonight, I'll roast you and eat you. Feng Ling paused and rolled her eyes at him. Even if I bring a pile of wild boar meat and place it in front of you, you'll still eat me. You speak as though you'll let me sleep peacefully in bed one night. With that, she pointed to the little wild boar. And this is too small. It looks like it was born less than half a month ago. If you want to eat fresh and tender meat, you have to look at the size. This kind of meat is not fresh and tender. It's too tender. It's not delicious at all. Li Nanheng looked at her condescendingly and narrowed his eyes. Then do as I say. Raise it first and eat it when it grows up. The corner of Feng Ling's mouth twitched. I don't lack food. Why do I have to raise it? Even if humans live at the top of the food chain, they have feelings for it. How can they eat it? If you don't want to eat it, then raise it. It just so happens that I lack a living creature by my side. It can help you relieve your boredom. There are so many living creatures in this jungle. Why don't I catch a few non-poisonous snakes and let them sleep under our bed every day? Li Nanheng snorted, bent down to hold her chin, and decisively kissed her hard on the lips. When Feng Ling was kissed until she almost fell to the ground, he said hoarsely, Up to you. If you like such excitement, I'll accompany you. Excitement? The excitement of raising snakes under the bed? I shudder at the thought. Feng Ling quickly slapped his hand away. I don't want to raise you. I don't want to raise anyone else. Let this little wild boar go. Let's eat something else. The man saw that she insisted on letting it go, and had no objection. Feng Ling quickly released the little wild boar's front hooves. The little thing howled twice and quickly turned around and jumped far away. This thing's running speed was not like that of poultry. Wild boars were born with fast speed. The reason why Feng Ling was fast was because when she was young, she had to be fast in order to eat in the jungle. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to catch anything. You're not going to shower anymore? Seeing that the man did not take the little wild boar seriously and was about to kiss her again, she raised her hand to block him. I'm covered in sweat, Li Nanheng chuckled. He recalled that he had been busy for a long time in the morning and was covered in sweat. Her body was clean and emitted a fresh smell. He kissed her lips again, but this time, he only tasted it lightly and did not go too deep. He turned and went back to the stream to take a shower. This stream was very shallow. Many places were only more than 10 centimeters deep. The deepest place was where he was standing, but it was barely up to the man's waist. The man stood there and leaned back leisurely. He picked up a blade of grass and held it in his mouth. Feng Ling watched for a while, walked over, and deliberately splashed water on his head. The man did not dodge but teased. Why? Do you want to help your husband shower personally? What husband? Up until now, Feng Ling was too embarrassed to call him husband. This man kept calling her little wife every day. Furthermore, before she slept, she had asked him about it. The reason why Li Nanheng had never explained to her about marrying the cenotaph was because the Feng and Li families had an agreement. Within 3 years, no one could know that the Li family had married the Feng family cenotaph. After all, this kind of thing was too unbelievable to outsiders. In order to respect a dead child and not let others spread rumors, he had to abide by this 3-year agreement. Within 3 years, he would not marry another woman and would not explain this strange marriage. However, this was only a verbal agreement between the two families. It was not like they were really married. Furthermore, to Li Nanheng, he only married a few pieces of clothes she had worn when she was young. However, he had been shamelessly calling her his little wife all day long, as if she had completely and utterly belonged to him. She splashed the water on his head again, and looked at the old scars on his back that were not too obvious, but could be seen. These scars were not ugly on his body. As a man who came out of 11 base, it was impossible for him not to have a few old scars on his body. People did not live in a fairy tale world. No one was perfect and invincible, and it was inevitable to have some injuries occasionally. However, the gunshot wound on the back of his shoulder. Feng Ling placed her hand on his gunshot wound. She had once used a dagger to help him remove the bullet here. At that time, the man was sweating in pain, but did not make a sound. At that time in Boston, he protected her in his arms and helped her block the bullet. Later, although he was clearly so weak, he still raised his gun and appeared when she was almost surrounded, like a god descending. Her fingers stroked there for a long time. The man saw that her hand did not leave, and gently rubbed it repeatedly. He knew what she was thinking, and raised his hand to press her hand there. If you want to help me bathe, come down and bathe together. Don't secretly take advantage of me. Who took advantage of you? Feng Ling patted his hand again, and lowered her head to look at the grass in his mouth. You haven't smoked since you came here. Are you addicted to smoking again? The man didn't answer directly. He just casually leaned back, narrowed his eyes and looked at the fine light sprinkling down from the dense leaves above. He just responded with a shallow "N." I saw that there were a few boxes in the travel bag you brought. But why haven't you smoked? The man curved his lips slightly and said leisurely, It's not safe to smoke in the jungle. After all, this is the place where you lived when you were young. It's too clean, and has too many memories of you. It can't be polluted by any external things, not even second-hand smoke. W. 4M. Chapter 1247. She knew that this man was usually so bad that it was impossible for him to have such a profound consciousness. But he really didn't smoke since he came here. Sometimes, she saw men holding a blade of grass in their mouths. She had heard from some brothers in the base who wanted to quit smoking, that men quitting smoking was like detoxification. Although it was not as painful, it was not good either. The way to relieve this discomfort was to put something in their mouth. It was good to eat some snacks. If there were no snacks, they would hold something to relieve their addiction. But she didn't know how long it would take to really quit. In the past, Li Nanheng did smoke a lot, and she occasionally told him to smoke less. It was okay to smoke, but not too much. She was afraid that his body couldn't take it. Now in this clean and fresh jungle, after not smoking for several months, his lungs seemed to have been washed by the air several times. Feng Ling curved her lips slightly and hugged his neck from behind. As if rewarding him, she kissed his wet hair. After Feng Ling disappeared for 4 months, Li Nanheng also disappeared for half a year after temporarily leaving the base. However, before Boss Li left, he arranged a lot of things in the base. He also went back to the Li family to make sure that the elders were in good health, and everything that he needed to worry about was taken care of before leaving. Therefore, this half a year was neither fast nor slow, and there weren't many troublesome matters. Occasionally, there were some problems that needed Boss Li to deal with and make a decision himself. The base hall couldn't get through to him, so they could only send him a message. However, after the message was sent, it would take a few days for Li Nanheng to reply. There was almost no signal in the jungle. Occasionally, there would be some weak signals when they walked a little further away. There was a solar charger developed by the United Nations Science and Technology Museum in 11 base, so the power of his cell phone could last a long time. However, because there was nothing troublesome, Li Nanheng didn't touch his cell phone most of the time. After all, he still had the Li family and the base behind him, so he couldn't really leave them alone. Occasionally, he would take a few minutes to reply to messages and deal with problems. Half a year ago, it was still the transition season between spring and summer, and in the blink of an eye, it was almost winter. However, because Li Nanheng was here, Feng Ling didn't have to sit by the fire every day. The cabin was warm and comfortable every day. Feng Ling watched as the man returned with his phone, and knew that he had gone to find a place with a signal to reply to a message. She supported her chin with one hand, and leaned against the window of the cabin. She watched the man's tall and straight figure, and thought about how the two of them had unknowingly spent half a year here. For half a year, they didn't separate from each other at all times. This kind of time was something that they had never experienced before. But it was also so short that it made people wonder if life was really fleeting. How come it's been half a year? It was true that she had left for too long. She had enough time to rest and recuperate, but she couldn't bear to part with this place. She couldn't bear to part with Li Nanheng every day and night, and she couldn't bear to part with this home they had built bit by bit. As time dragged on, winter came in the blink of an eye. Li Nanheng walked back to the cabin, and was about to throw the phone back on the bed, when he saw that Feng Ling was holding her own phone. She hadn't touched her phone in months, Help me charge my phone too, she said. Li Nanheng glanced at her. What are you doing? In a few months after this winter, the weather will warm up. Let's go back. Feng Ling raised her phone. Before I go back, I have to restore contact with my old friends and take the time to answer their various questions. Otherwise, when we go back one day, I'll probably be drowned by their questions and saliva. If you don't want to go back, you don't have to force yourself to go back. How can I not want to go back? I just came out for a few months on vacation. It's not like I want to be out of touch with this world. Feng Ling placed her phone on the bed. And it's impossible to live in such a place for the rest of your life, unless you're completely carefree. But how can you be carefree in this world? Even people like me, who have no family since I was young, have responsibilities that I have to shoulder, let alone you. Feng Ling put her phone on the bed. Li Nanheng looked at her and did not say anything. He walked over, picked up her phone, glanced at it, and then looked at her. Are you willing? Of course. Feng Ling also looked at him seriously. Besides, I haven't officially married you yet. Don't tell me you really plan to use the reason of marrying my cenotaph to make me your wild wife in this deep mountain forest? I don't even have a proper marriage process. I'm afraid I won't be able to die in peace. Li Nanheng chuckled. Just because of this. What else do you want? Feng Ling tilted her head and glared at him. All right, I'll get married when I go back. I'll marry you first. The man nodded and helped her connect her phone to the solar charger. He then reached out and hugged the little woman, who was becoming more and more intimate with him. He let her sit on his lap. You can only be tied to me for the rest of your life. After all, I made a vow in front of the Feng family's 2 elders and the Li family's 4 elders. Feng Ling had never heard of his vow, but from this sentence, she could guess how much this man had done for her after knowing that she was the Feng family's 2nd daughter. She asked, What vow did you make in front of them? The man's cold brows moved slightly. Even though there was no one around except for the birds and beasts in the jungle, he still bent down and whispered a few words into her ear. When she suddenly heard this man say that he would never marry anyone except the 2nd daughter of the Feng family, her face instantly heated up. She raised her hand to slap his face away, but the man held her head and kissed her. He turned around and pressed her down on the bed. Los Angeles, the Feng family. Bang! In the hall of the Feng family, Tang Sankai was almost knocked down by old Madame Feng. She stood in place in shock, looking at Feng Mingzhu and Qin Xiu, who were arguing inside. The servants rushed forward to support the expensive Tang Sankai and old Madame Feng. At this time, Grandfather Feng also entered the door. Seeing the situation inside, he immediately frowned. What happened? Feng Mingzhu abruptly turned her eyes and saw her grandfather and grandmother who had entered the door. Her eyes, which were already red from crying, instantly turned even redder. She clenched her fists tightly. Tell me, how long have you known? Qin Xiu was still glaring at her. For the first time, Qin Xiu, who had been used to speaking gently and softly to her daughter, spoke to her in such an attitude. Her eyes were even redder than Feng Mingzhu's. W. 4M. Chapter 1248. What's wrong? Why are you arguing here? Grandfather Feng suddenly shouted. At the same time, he saw a stack of documents on the coffee table. He narrowed his eyes and walked over. When Grandfather Feng was about to touch the stack of documents, Feng Mingzhu suddenly reached out and grabbed them, as if she had been electrocuted. She messed up the documents and scattered them on the ground. She didn't want them to see them. Seeing her action, Qin Xiu was so angry that her eyes turned red and her forehead twitched. Mingzhu, that's your sister. Before Grandfather Feng could figure out what was going on, he abruptly raised his old but bright eyes to look at Qin Xiu. What? At this moment, Grandmother Feng walked over tremblingly with the help of a servant. She looked at Feng Mingzhu and Qin Xiu in shock. When you two were arguing just now, you said that my poor little granddaughter was still alive. She was still alive, right? Did I hear wrong? Feng Mingzhu had obtained the 2nd DNA report of Feng Ling a long time ago. After checking it, she threw it into the safe. After so long, she almost forgot about it. This morning, she asked her mother to help her go back to her room to get something from the safe, but she saw it. Although Qin Xiu had long guessed that Feng Ling was her daughter, after all, Feng Ling didn't seem to want to go home. Besides, Feng Ling looked very peaceful and happy in 11 base. She only wanted to see her daughter happy. Although she wanted to acknowledge her, she couldn't bear to disturb her, so she didn't pursue the matter. Although she thought about it every day, she didn't dare to acknowledge her. However, when she suddenly saw this DNA report, the truth that Feng Ling was her second daughter was completely revealed to her. Most importantly, this DNA report was in Mingzhu's safe. This meant that she had long known about Feng Ling, but for so long, she had remained silent at home. In the past 10 months, she had changed from an ignorant and incompetent young lady to someone who had frequently come into contact with the affairs of the Feng family's major companies and was working hard to take over the inheritance of the Feng family. Qin Xiu thought that her eldest daughter had grown up after those things. She didn't expect that this was the reason. She was furious. She even hated her daughter for failing to live up to her expectations. This child was actually worried that her sister would be recognized one day. She was afraid that everything would be taken away, or everything would be taken away. She was so sensitive that even after knowing the truth, she did not say a word. She had been quietly hiding this fact. That was why Qin Xiu took advantage of the time when there was no one at home to look for Feng Mingzhu. Coincidentally, Feng Mingzhu had just returned from the company and drank some wine outside, but she was not very drunk. As soon as she entered the door, she was stopped by Qin Xiu. Qin Xiu threw the DNA report and all the documents about Feng Ling on the coffee table and asked her what she thought. At that time, Feng Mingzhu was stunned for a moment. Her eyes first turned from confusion to panic, and then from panic to coldness. In the end, the mother and daughter quarreled. Qin Xiu's disappointment and question, as well as Feng Mingzhu's anger and sharp voice, were heard by the old madam, who had entered the door a few minutes earlier. Then grandfather Feng entered the door. As if knowing that she couldn't hide it anymore, Feng Mingzhu looked at the messy documents and DNA report on the coffee table and asked in a shrill voice, "So what if she's alive? I haven't had any family for 20 years. So what if she's alive? I'm your granddaughter, I'm your daughter, I'm your beloved. Even if she's still alive, she won't come back. What else do you have to worry about?" Qin Xiu was furious. She had never thought of forcing Feng Ling to return to this family. But Mingzhu actually looked at all of this from such a twisted perspective. Fortunately, there was a servant to support her. She couldn't believe it. She raised her hand in disbelief, trembled, and then put it down. "She's alive. She's really alive. My little granddaughter is still alive." Grandfather Feng was also excited, but after all, he was old and had seen decades of storms. Back then, he could withstand the news that his granddaughter had died at the bottom of the sea. How could he not be able to withstand it now? He looked at Feng Mingzhu's red eyes, then at Qin Xiu, and then at the documents on the floor. He turned his head and gave a look to the helper next to him. The helper only dared to go up and pick up the papers after receiving the old man's order. "If you dare to pick them up, tear them all. Tear them all." Feng Mingzhu shouted angrily. She regretted it. If she had known, she would have torn these things up and destroyed them all. Back then, she only felt that it was necessary to keep these things. After all, if she wanted to do something in the future, it might be very troublesome to check them again. So she simply hid them in the safe. She didn't expect that they would become a time bomb now. Grandfather Feng was the head of the family. The servant didn't dare to look at her. She hurriedly picked up the things and tidied them up. When she saw the contents of the documents, she quickly controlled the excited expression on her face and quickly handed them to Grandfather Feng. Grandmother Feng rushed over and stood by the elder's side, watching him flip through them one by one. When she saw all the information about Feng Ling, including Feng Ling's photo, and the contents of the DNA test report, Grandmother Feng was so excited that she suddenly snatched the document with Feng Ling's photo. She stared at the short-haired but calm smile on the girl's face. She raised her trembling hand and carefully touched it. Tears fell. "This is my little granddaughter." The servants were also excited. After all, they were all old servants of the Feng family. After the second miss was born, They also took care of the child for an entire year. The death of this child was a huge blow to the entire Feng family. Now that this child was still alive, everyone was very excited. Seeing their excited expressions, Feng Mingzhu's eyes were filled with a destructive blow. She staggered back, looked at the things in their hands, and then turned to look at Qin Xiu, who was holding her chest in anger. Mom, you knew it long ago. Did you know it but you didn't say it? Now you're blaming me? Qin Xiu took a deep breath and suddenly raised her hand to slap her. I didn't say it because I respected her choice. I didn't want to disturb her current peace. I just wanted her to live happily outside. But you hid these things and refused to say it. You know why? W. 4M. Chapter 1249. Since she was born, she had never been slapped by her mother. This sudden slap caused Feng Mingzhu to stagger back. She looked at her grandparents, who suddenly raised their eyes to look at her. She saw the excitement in their eyes and the flash of surprise. Mingzhu already knew? Grandfather Feng's hands trembled as he held the documents, but his voice was directed at Feng Mingzhu. Why didn't you tell me? Feng Mingzhu bit her lips and looked at them coldly. Qin Xiu was so angry that she clutched her chest and sat on the sofa. Grandmother Feng was still very agitated. She kept staring at the girl in the photo, and then raised her eyes to look at them. Where is this child now? Where is she? Grandfather Feng lowered his head to continue reading the documents in his hands. As he read, he said, There's information here. Her name is Feng Ling. This is an 11 base. Grandfather Feng's expression suddenly froze. He whispered in surprise, She's in Li Nanhing's place? The two old men gathered together and kept looking at the documents as though they couldn't wait to see a living person in front of them. As Grandfather Feng finished reading all the documents, he could no longer maintain his composure. He asked Qin Xiu anxiously, Xiao Qiu, have you seen this child? Qin Xiu's anger eased a little. She moved her hand away from her chest and said softly, It's a coincidence. When I accompanied my mother out to buy things, my mother's bag was stolen by a robber. It was Feng Ling who passed by and helped snatch the bag back. Just like that, we met for the first time. Qin Xiu briefly told him what had happened and then said, When I first found out that her surname was Feng, I didn't think much about it. Later, when I guessed that she might be my daughter, I remembered the small jade pendant she had been wearing since she was born. There was a Feng character engraved on it. I guess someone made her use this surname because of her jade pendant. The more Grandmother Feng listened, the more agitated she became. Even though it was already dark outside, she still turned her head to look out. As she looked, she held her old man's hand tightly. Old man, let's go see her. Let's go bring our little granddaughter back. Hearing that they were going to bring her back now, Feng Mingzhu glared at them angrily. Bring her back? Are you sure you want to bring her back? We don't even know if she wants to return to the Feng family. You're going to pick her up just like this? Sensing Feng Mingzhu's anger, the two elders of the Feng family looked at her again. Grandfather Feng looked at her. Mingzhu, what are you angry about? That's your sister, your biological sister. When you were young, you heard that your little sister fell into the sea. At that time, didn't you cry? Don't you remember that when you were young, you often kissed her in swaddling clothes? We're of the same blood. Why? Feng Mingzhu sneered. If you were me, would you be happy? Grandfather Feng paused and looked at her. After all, she was his granddaughter. No matter how many unreasonable things she had done, he would never think of her from a dark angle. He didn't think about how sensitive she was at this moment. He just looked at her and couldn't understand why she looked so determined, as if she would sever ties with the Feng family, as long as they dared to bring Feng Ling back. Enough. Do you still want the whole family to see your dark thoughts? Qin Xiu suddenly scolded her and turned to glare at Feng Mingzhu. Go back to your room and think about what you did wrong. I was wrong. Feng Mingzhu's face was still red. She chuckled softly, but her voice was cold, and her voice was sharp and full of anger. Mom, I wasn't the one who threw my child into the sea. You're the sinner of the Feng family. I'm not. Why should I be wrong? What did I do wrong? Qin Xiu's face instantly turned pale because of her words. She looked at her eldest daughter in disbelief. Bastard, What nonsense are you talking about? Grandfather Feng suddenly said angrily. Mingzhu apologized to your mother. Feng Mingzhu didn't speak. She just looked at Qin Qiu's pale face, then at old Madame Feng, who couldn't hide her nervousness and excitement because of the news of her little granddaughter, and then at Grandfather Feng, who was glaring at her. Look. She just found out that her sister was not dead. She just found out that Feng Ling was still alive. Now the whole family was on the verge of ganging up on her. If Feng Ling was really brought back one day, half of the Feng family's daughter's name would be given to her. Everything that belonged to her since she was young would be taken away by the person who should have died long ago. Perhaps they would compensate her more because of their guilt towards Feng Ling. Perhaps they would even ask her, as her sister, to give in to her and endure some grievances. In short, as long as Feng Ling was still alive in this world, it would be a devastating blow to her. I asked you to apologize, but you're still glaring at me? Grandfather Feng finally saw the seriousness of the matter from Feng Mingzhu's resentful expression. He suddenly narrowed his eyes and said, Just now, your mother said that you already knew that these DNA and information were investigated by yourself. After knowing the results, you didn't tell anyone. You didn't want your sister to come back? Old Madame Feng also looked at her in disbelief. Mingzhu, how could you bear to let your sister wander outside? Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't I say anything? Feng Mingzhu opened her mouth, but she stood there quietly. Her eyes were a little empty, and her voice was flat and emotionless. Only a sneer could be seen on her lips, but it also flashed past. That's right. Why didn't I say what I was afraid of? Qin Qiu looked at her expression as if she had been hit. Although she was angry, she couldn't bear to see her trapped in that dilemma. She frowned and said, Mingzhu, you're no longer a child. You understand the logic very well. You've all grown up. Even if Feng Ling returns to the Feng family, no one will compete with you for the love of the elders. Besides, you know how the Feng family does things. Even if she comes back, the family won't be biased. You're still the apple of the Feng family's eye. Everything you want will still belong to you. Put down those knots in your heart. Whether she wants to come back or not, you have to get along well with her, okay? All right. Feng Mingzhu raised her chin slightly, the emotions in her eyes still unclear. If she really comes back, I will definitely get along well with her. Chapter 1250. Her tone didn't sound sincere, but now was not the time to argue with her. Qin Qiu looked at her for a while, and could feel the anger and injustice hidden in her heart. She was about to say something when Grandfather Feng held the documents in his hand and said, Why is our little granddaughter in Li Nanhing's place? She's just a girl. How did she get into 11 base? Even, he pointed at the documents in his hand. She's in a place like 11 base, yet she has such a thick pile of documents. A girl who ranks first in all kinds of assessments, and is recognized as one of the strongest snipers in 11 base. What else? Drill master and champion. What exactly did she experience? When she first saw Feng Ling, Qin Qiu and her mother almost recognized her because of her appearance. But at that time, Feng Ling was still trying her best to pretend to be a man in order to survive. Qin Qiu looked at the documents in Grandfather Feng's hand. Her previous guess was now 100% confirmed. Her heart was in turmoil, and her voice was filled with suppressed heartache. She disguised as a man and mingled in 11 base to survive. I don't know what she experienced, but to be able to force a good girl to disguise as a man, it means that she must have had a bad life before entering 11 base. In the photo, Feng Ling looked very beautiful, but when she heard that she had a bad life before, Grandmother Feng's tears instantly fell. I'm going to bring her back now. Auntie Mai, quickly tidy up her room. Let's change everything into new ones. Buy everything that a girl likes and put it in. I want to bring her back and compensate her for all the things that I owe her for more than 20 years. My granddaughter has suffered too much. I must let her come back and enjoy a good life. Auntie Mai, quickly go and tidy up her room. Let's change everything into new ones. Buy everything that a girl likes and put it in. I want to bring her back and compensate her for all the things that I owe her for more than 20 years. My granddaughter has suffered too much. I must let her come back and enjoy a good life. All right, madam. I'll go right away. The old servant of the Feng family, Auntie Mai, nodded excitedly. I'll definitely prepare all the things that second miss might like since she was young. I'll let her feel the warmth of the family as soon as she comes back, and let her believe that we really love her. Grandmother Feng couldn't stop her tears. She held her old man's hand. Old man, I can't take it anymore. I'm going to look for her now. Let's go together. Grandfather Feng nodded. He folded the documents in his hands neatly like treasures, and handed them to another servant by the side. Then he turned to walk out with his wife. Seeing that they were about to bring her back, Feng Mingzhu bit her lip, and stood behind the coffee table in silence. Qin Xiu also wanted to take Feng Ling back, but she remembered that Feng Ling seemed to have guessed something at that time, but she didn't say it out, and it seemed that she wasn't used to speaking in front of the elders. If the Feng family rashly went to 11 base to pick her up, not to mention that there were so many rules in 11 base, would they let her go easily? It was also unknown whether Feng Ling would be willing to go with them. Wait a moment. Qin Xiu stood up and said, Dad, Mom, it's too late now. Even if we want to bring her back, we need to have a detailed plan. This child has been away from us for almost 21 years. If a family suddenly runs to her and tells her that we are her grandparents and her parents, no one can adapt and accept it immediately. I think we'd better not scare her. Yes, that makes sense. Grandfather Feng also nodded and looked at the sky outside. It's indeed too late. What if my granddaughter is scared? But right now we can't sleep at all. What's her phone number? Can you give her a call, and let us hear her voice first? Qin Xiu shook her head. Feng Ling was a very cautious person, and she was used to keeping an appropriate distance from others. After meeting her a few times, she was not unfamiliar with her. But Feng Ling had never left her phone number. Even when Qin Xiu told her number to Feng Ling just sat there with a faint smile, and did not have any intention of remembering it. She didn't want to remember it, nor did she want to have any private contact. Her personality was very alienated. It was impossible to know what this child had experienced when she was young, but looking at her cold personality, she could guess that it was definitely not a warm childhood experience. She was very defensive. Then call the hall of their base. I have the number of their base hall. After speaking, Grandfather Feng turned to make the call. Hearing this, everyone in the Feng family subconsciously followed. They all wanted to hear the voice of this second miss who had been dead for more than 20 years. Qin Xiu also stood up and walked over. She also wanted to see Feng Ling, and she also missed her. She was just afraid that the child would be too resistant, but she still thought about it in her heart. Seeing that everyone was surrounding the old man, they just wanted to listen to a phone call. That's all. Feng Mingzhu clenched her fists tightly by her sides and looked at them coldly. The call went through. Grandfather Feng first held his breath, and then tried his best to remain calm, and politely asked a few questions. After greeting Ah Feng, he gradually asked about Feng Ling. On the other side of the phone, Ah Feng didn't understand why the Feng family's grandfather would ask about Feng Ling. Of course, he wouldn't say anything to an outsider. He simply said, Feng Ling is not in the base recently. Hearing this, Grandmother Feng immediately became nervous and asked softly, My granddaughter is not here? Even though she had lowered her voice, Ah Feng still heard her clearly. Granddaughter, the Feng family's granddaughter? Who was Feng Ling? In an instant, some things that Ah Feng had not been able to understand completely connected in his mind. Boss Li and Feng Ling? So that was what was going on. Feng Ling claimed to be an orphan, and her background was indeed clean. No one knew that Boss Li married a cenotaph. It was only recently that they heard some rumors that the Feng family actually had a second daughter. Could that child be Feng Ling? Hearing the conversation of the Feng family on the other side of the phone, Ah Feng could basically confirm the relationship. Although he didn't know where Feng Ling was, from the location displayed on Boss Li's phone, they should be near Malibu Beach. It was a wild jungle nearby, and very few people went there. However, Boss Li had stayed there for a long time, which was enough to prove that Feng Ling was there. Chapter 1251. The jungle outside the cabin was already winter. Even though it was not covered with snow, it was still cold. Inside the wooden house, it was as warm as spring. There was a fire in the clean stove, and there was a safe makeshift stove by the window. The stove was covered with barbed wire, and it was very clean. Half a piece of bacon that hadn't been eaten in the afternoon was hanging on top of the barbed wire, and it was slowly being smoked and warmed up. It could be eaten anytime and anywhere. However, the room was not quiet at this moment. A few birds were waiting to be fed in the temporary bird nest by the bed. They stretched out their necks and opened their mouths wide, waiting to be fed. Feng Ling picked up earthworms with tweezers and fed them into their mouths. From time to time, she smiled and teased these birds with big mouths. Speaking of these birds, she also wanted to laugh. Originally, she was just going to dig out the eggs out of habit and bring them back to make a meal. However, perhaps because it was winter and the mother bird had flown off somewhere, the nest fell under the tree. She saw it and picked it up, but she didn't want to eat it that night. She didn't know how she happened to cover the nest with a thick coat, and it was in a warm place near the stove. On the third night, when she remembered the eggs, and was about to come back to get them, she found that the top of a few of the eggs had cracked. Then, she watched helplessly as the first bird struggled out of the cracked egg. Then, one after another, she had harvested a nest of starving little birds. At that time, Li Nanheng had just returned from outside. He saw Feng Ling squatting by the bird nest by the bed, and didn't know what to do. He thought something had happened to her. But when he walked over, he saw these little things in front of her. "What are you?" Hearing the man's words, Feng Ling raised her head to look at him in a daze. She then pointed to the few little things in front of her and said, "I originally wanted to make some egg drop soup tonight, but I didn't expect these little birds to hatch from our clothes." Li Nanheng looked at the two thick clothes next to him, and then at the remaining eggs that were gradually cracking at this time. Looking at the little things that kept crying out with their mouths wide open, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Do you want to raise them?" Li Nanheng asked with a smile. "I want to eat." Feng Ling's expression was very sincere. Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows. "Eat them? I want to eat bird eggs. The weather has been cold recently. These eggs are not as easy to find as in the summer." Feng Ling's expression was blank and melancholy. "But a bird actually hatched. What should I do?" Li Nanheng chuckled. He knew that Feng Ling was straightforward. If she said she wanted to eat, she really wanted to eat. However, these birds were too small. Even if she wanted to make some bird meat soup, it was not possible, so he could only smile and say, "Do as you see fit." Feng Ling squatted in front of the birds for a long time. In the end, she saw that they wanted to eat something. Coincidentally, there were many earthworms she had just dug out in the room. She didn't know what birds ate, but she heard that they ate worms. Earthworms should be able to do the same, right? So she tried to feed it, and she didn't expect it to work. So she fed them continuously for about a week, and also raised these birds for a whole week. Li Nanheng came in, and saw that she was feeding the birds. He walked over, and gently kicked the nest she had specially made with some old cloth. Of course, he only touched it lightly, and Feng Ling quickly raised her hand to slap him away. Don't touch them." Li Nanheng smiled. "I think they have grown up a lot in the past few days. They can be cooked into soup." Feng Ling's expression froze. She looked at him abruptly, only to see that the man was standing there condescendingly, with a malicious smile. The corner of her mouth twitched, and she hurriedly bent down to carry the nest of birds to the bed like she was protecting her cubs. She used her body to block the nest as she said, "I've been raising them for a week. If you dare to eat them, I won't let you off." Not only did Li Nanheng not walk away, but he even leaned closer. While she was squatting by the bed, he leaned down and trapped her by the bed. He lowered his head and kissed her on the cheek. "How do you want to be with me?" Feng Ling quickly pushed him with her hand. "Don't mess around. Don't press them down. They are still young, and their feathers haven't fully grown. I'm warning you, don't have any ideas about them. If you want to eat them, go eat something else. I'll raise these few like this, you." Before she could finish speaking, the man bent down to hug her and kissed her hard. They had been together like this every day for half a year, but Li Nanheng's passion for her did not decrease. In fact, It was as though he loved her more and more every day. His passion had never decreased. Feng Ling had long gotten used to his habit of wanting to kiss her, touch her, and press her down on the bed. After being kissed for a while, the man finally let go of her, touched her shoulder-length hair, and kissed her in the hair. He then hugged her and smiled. Feng Ling didn't know what this man was smiling about, but she instinctively felt that he was definitely thinking of something bad. Of course, she didn't expect that Li Nanheng was considering whether they should have a child, because he saw her protecting the birds. Feng Ling was not used to dealing with things with women, but in fact, she was still a woman in her bones. This kind of instinct was innate. The birds that she fed for a week were treated as treasures by her. If one day, she really gave birth to a child that belonged to them, just thinking about it was enough to look forward to it. Although she couldn't eat the bird meat soup, there was bacon for dinner. Feng Ling carefully cut the meat into thin slices and made 2 simple vegetarian dishes. Life in the jungle was not particularly simple because of Li Nanheng's existence. It could even be said to be extravagant. When Feng Ling was young, she made a living in the jungle, but Li Nanheng had been in the base for so many years, and his ability to survive in the wild was not much worse than hers. Many of the game was brought back by him, and it was especially rich. Every day, he did not lack food or clothes. At dinner, Feng Ling originally wanted to pick up a piece of bacon to eat, but for some reason, she suddenly felt nauseous. She abruptly put down her chopsticks and turned to the table to retch. "What's wrong?" "It's nothing. My stomach doesn't feel well." Feng Ling did not vomit anything for a long time. She took a sip of the warm water Li Nanheng handed her, took a deep breath, and picked up 2 vegetarian dishes with her chopsticks. She no longer ate meat. Li Nanheng looked at her and suddenly said, "Got it." Feng Ling didn't react at first. Half a minute later, when she understood what he meant, she almost dropped the bowl in her hand. "How is that possible?" Li Nanheng calmly smiled. "Although I'm very careful every time, no contraceptive measure can guarantee a 100% success rate." Feng Ling, asking for monthly votes. Chapter 1252. You can't guarantee it 100%. Of course, Feng Ling didn't understand this, but even if Li Nanheng didn't bring any condoms when he came here, he would pay attention to it every time they ended in bed. Before she was completely ready, before she really married into the Li family, he wouldn't let her get pregnant easily. He wouldn't let her fall into a dilemma or be forced into a situation. "I've been here for almost half a year." Li Nanheng didn't say much. Just this sentence, coupled with his meaningful gaze, was enough for her to understand what he meant. In this kind of place, the nightlife was not as rich as it was outside. There were not as many entertainment methods and activities. After the sky turned dark, they chatted for a while after eating. They casually took the round pebbles that Li Nanheng had polished with tools as chess pieces, and played with them on the ground for a while. Not long after, the 2 of them lay down and prepared to sleep. What did she do when she couldn't sleep? Of course, every night when she couldn't sleep, he would press her down on the bed and bully her. This man seemed to have an endless amount of energy, and it was always not enough. Unless she was on her monthly period or was really too tired, he really didn't rest at all. He did it at such a high frequency, and now he said that he couldn't guarantee a 100% success rate, which meant that she might really be pregnant. Otherwise, why would she suddenly feel disgusted? Feng Ling didn't know what counted as pregnancy, but according to what she had seen of Jin Wan, it seemed that she often felt inexplicably disgusted and couldn't eat food that was too oily or too meaty. Thinking about her state just now, wasn't it about the same? Seeing the confusion and helplessness in her eyes, Li Nanheng put down the cutlery. "Let's go to the hospital tomorrow?" Feng Ling was startled and returned to look at him. Both of them knew that she had been in the base for 10 months. In the past 10 months, she had never left the jungle. There were only a few times when she needed to buy some necessities. Li Nanheng had taken advantage of the time when he was contacting the base to go outside the jungle to find his car parked in a secluded parking lot, drive to the city, buy some things, and then continue to accompany her here. Malibu Beach was a scenic area that had been open to the public. However, not many people would approach the area near the jungle. After all, it was rumored that there were all kinds of ferocious beasts in the jungle. In fact, it was just that the local tourism bureau did not want this large natural jungle to be destroyed and disturbed by tourists. However, not far from here, there were many institutions, parking lots, large supermarkets, hospitals, and many hotels with sea views. Li Nanheng's car was parked nearby. If they really left the jungle, everything would be very convenient. Feng Ling had originally planned to leave after the winter was over. She didn't think too much about whether she should go out to find a hospital right now. What really made her a little nervous was, what if there really is? If you have one, get married and give birth immediately. The man's words were very smooth. Feng Ling's voice faltered and she stared at him. What? You don't want to give birth? You're not ready yet? Li Nanheng raised his brows, his tone patient. No. Feng Ling looked at him and said, I've just never experienced such a thing. I don't know what to do. Other than going to the hospital for a checkup. What else do I have to do? Li Nanheng smiled. His voice was deep and carried a hint of a smile. You speak as if I've experienced it before. Go to the hospital for a checkup first, and then listen to the doctor? After all, if she was really pregnant, it would not be a joke. Feng Ling nodded and ate a few more mouthfuls before cleaning up the dishes. Seeing that she was eager to end the day and sleep as soon as possible, as though she could go to the hospital for a checkup tomorrow morning, Li Nanheng smiled at her. Don't be too nervous. No, I'm not nervous. Feng Ling placed the bowl and chopsticks in the water and was about to wash them. However, at this moment, the man behind her walked over and took her hand out of the water. He naturally took over the work of washing the dishes and comforted her as he washed. I'm usually so careful. Although it's not 100% successful, I think the chances of being pregnant shouldn't be very high. If you're not pregnant, our original plan won't be disrupted. If you're really pregnant, if you're not prepared to be a mother, you can give birth and throw it to the Li family. The 4 elders of the Li family will definitely take turns to take care of the child. There's no need to worry. Feng Ling originally didn't think so much. Hearing his words, she immediately replied. Throw it to the Li family? You want to use the word throw on your own child? Li Nanheng's lips curved up. As he washed, he looked back and pecked her lips. You haven't confirmed whether you're pregnant or not, and you're already starting to protect your child? Are you going to argue with me over a single word? Realizing that she had been teased by him, Feng Ling glared at him and ignored him. She turned to sit back on the bed and looked at her stomach from time to time. So if you're really pregnant, do you plan to take care of the child yourself in the future? Li Nanheng washed the dishes and turned to help her boil the bathwater. Now that the weather was cold, they couldn't go to the stream to wash. There was a large water bucket in the room that Li Nanheng had built. 2 buckets a day were enough for the 2 of them to cook, wash things, and boil water for bathing at night. However, it was a little troublesome to fetch water back every day. Of course, Li Nanheng snatched away the hard work. I've never thought about it. As Feng Ling spoke, she subconsciously placed her hand on her stomach. She recalled that when Jin Wan was pregnant, she would subconsciously protect her stomach. So this was how it felt. She didn't know if she was pregnant or not, but she already had this kind of consciousness. So, when Jin Wan woke up in the hospital and found that her child was gone, how did she survive those months, especially when Mr. Imo hadn't woken up yet? How painful and sad must she have been? I didn't think about it before, but now I can think about it seriously. When Li Nanheng walked past the bed, he pinched her chin and continued to get the water. After a few months, this young master of the Li family had already gotten used to loving her, taking care of her, and trying to make her do as little as possible. He rushed to do everything that he could do, causing Feng Ling to get used to being taken care of by him. She didn't even need to prepare the bathwater herself. When Li Nanheng prepared the water and gestured for her to go take a shower, Feng Ling lowered her head to observe her flat stomach as she bathed. What did it feel like to be a mother? She suddenly recalled that time in the coffee shop. Qin Qiu had sat in front of her and kept staring at her face. That kind of careful, warm gaze, but she didn't dare to approach. Chapter 1253. After living in the jungle for these months, Feng Ling had figured out many things. In fact, there was indeed no fault. Back then, her parents had accidentally left her in the sea. In the vast sea late at night. Even the crew on the cruise ship couldn't find her. Could it be that her parents had to jump into the sea in exchange for her life? The Feng family had never forgotten her. They were not cold-blooded. They even cherished the memory of her dead, and had always kept her in their hearts. Although when she recalled her childhood experience, she felt that it was really a miracle to be able to walk out of the jungle alive and enter 11 base alive to change her life. But after all, she was a miracle itself. This was something she should be thankful for. Besides, she had never lacked the love of her family, and there was a man like Li Nanheng by her side. She was actually very satisfied. There was nothing to hate. All she had was contentment. So if she really left the jungle, she might find time to see Qin Qiu. Of course, she wouldn't go to the Feng family, but Qin Qiu was her mother after all. Between mother and daughter, they should have a face-to-face conversation. After all, she had given birth to and raised her. At least, she could tell that Qin Qiu really respected her. Such a mother shouldn't be left out. At least, she should be given a sense of security. After all, for so many years, the person who suffered the most must be Qin Qiu. Seeing her alone and calling her mom should make Qin Qiu very happy, right? Thinking of this, Feng Ling's heart warmed up. The next day, Feng Ling woke up very early and went to prepare breakfast as usual. She slept early last night. Although she woke up early today, she was very energetic. After all, last night, Li Nanheng was worried about her body. If she was really pregnant, he definitely couldn't touch her easily. Last night, the man tossed and turned on the bed. In the end, he hugged her to sleep. After falling asleep, his hands were still restless, and insisted on holding her firmly in his arms. After making sure that she was always his, he gradually fell asleep. Feng Ling woke up early, and Li Nanheng also woke up. The man lay on the bed, tilting his head to watch her back and forth preparing breakfast. He supported his head with one hand and stared at her for a long time, a smile on his lips. Sensing that the man had woken up and was watching her, Feng Ling placed the breakfast on the stove to heat it up, and turned back to look at him. "Why are you looking at me?" "I'm thinking, although there are too many responsibilities in life, we can't stay in this kind of place for the rest of our lives. But when we get old, maybe we can come back to live here. At that time, I'll build a house for you. I'll have experience building another house. How about building a 2-story house?" Feng Ling chuckled and poked the flame in the stove with a small wooden stick. After watching the fire burn brighter, she gently shook the small wooden stick in her hand. "If I'm really old, I won't be able to move easily. I can't even carry water. How can I live here? TSK, when the time comes, we'll prepare some water pipes from outside and extend them to the clear stream. We'll think of a way to direct the water over. Or if it really doesn't work, we'll drill a well near the house. As long as we can still breathe, we can do anything. What's there to worry about?" The man sneered. Originally, Feng Ling wanted to mock him for saying it was easy. It wasn't easy to connect a water pipe in such a place, but it wasn't impossible to drill a well. This place was close to the sea, and there was fresh water. It shouldn't be too deep to have water. She didn't say anything more. She just thought that if she could really come back in the future, it would indeed be quite exciting. In the past, she only felt that this place was very secluded and had too many things to do with her childhood. But now, the meaning of this jungle to her had long changed. Everything was because of Li Nanheng. Li Nanheng. It was really a name that changed her life. Feng Ling didn't realize that she was sitting by the stove and writing these words on the solid muddy ground with a small wooden stick. "What are you writing?" The man's voice suddenly appeared behind her. She suddenly shivered and subconsciously used her feet to cover the 3 slightly obvious words on the ground. She didn't notice when he got off the bed and walked over. Li Nanheng had long seen it. He bent down behind her and whispered into her ear with a low smile. "Why didn't I know that you love me so much? Sitting here early in the morning. You're so bored that you're writing my name on the ground to pass the time?" The wooden stick in her hand had been in the stove for a while, and there was a piece of semi-hard charcoal at the front. When she wrote on the ground, it would leave a black mark. Earlier, she had repeatedly written and traced here, making the originally unclear words clear. Li Nanheng's eyes were fine, so how could he not see it? At this moment, Feng Ling simply stepped on it with both feet, and silently hid her deep love under her feet. Li Nanheng laughed out loud because of her feminine side. Hearing his laughter, Feng Ling abruptly stood up and made a move. The man dodged in time. After a while, the two of them were playing on the bed. Feng Ling was out of breath from his kiss, and the fragrance of breakfast wafted in the air. Only then did they finally stop. Before leaving the jungle, Feng Ling extinguished the fire in the stove. After living here for so long, she usually paid the most attention to fire prevention. After all, in a place like the jungle, what she was most afraid of was fire. There were flammable flowers and trees all around, especially now that it was winter, and the air was dry. If she wasn't careful, it might cause a forest fire. Even if she only went to the hospital for a checkup, and would be back in a few hours, she still paid attention to this. When she first came out, Feng Ling did not feel uncomfortable, because she had been inside for 10 months. However, Li Nanheng's car was parked in front of the Malibu Beach scenic area. It was a little cold in this season, and there were very few tourists. There were only a few people nearby. Feng Ling looked at those people, and then at the sea not far away. Is there anything you're not used to? After getting into the car, Li Nanheng helped her buckle her seatbelt. At the same time, he circled her in the passenger seat, and looked at her with concern. Do you want to go straight to the hospital, or find a place to sit for a while? He considered that it had been a long time since she had seen other people. He didn't know if her interpersonal skills would be affected. After all, in the past, Feng Ling had always been very cautious in dealing with people, and was not very open-minded. I'm fine. Let's go straight to the hospital. Feng Ling blinked at him. I'm not that 5-year-old little girl who just walked out of it. I'm already used to it. Li Nanheng smiled, rubbed her head and started the engine. Chapter 1254. The nearest international hospital to Malibu Beach in Los Angeles. Feng Ling went to have her blood tested, and did several other tests. In the end, she confirmed that it was indeed just an upset stomach. The doctor asked her if she had eaten something cold a few days ago. Feng Ling recalled that the bacon she had eaten in the past few days might not be easy to digest, and because there was too much meat, she was afraid that it would go bad after a long time. She didn't want to waste food, so she ate more than usual and ate several meals in a row, causing food accumulation. Furthermore, when she drank water, she often drank cold water when Li Nanheng wasn't paying attention. If there was no hot water, she would drink cold water. This might have caused a burden on her stomach. That was why she suddenly experienced nausea, vomiting and loss of appetite. Right now, she felt disgusted when she saw bacon, because she had eaten too much these past few days. After confirming that she was not pregnant, although Li Nanheng knew that he was usually very careful, and that the possibility of pregnancy was not high, he still held the test report with a look of disappointment. In fact, he should be more careless occasionally. Perhaps in a few months his child would be born. When did Li Nanheng become so obedient? He actually restrained himself every time to prevent her from getting pregnant. What are you disappointed about? Feng Ling snatched the test report from his hand. It's not time yet. Tisk, how can I not be disappointed? Li Nanheng hugged his little wife, and walked towards the hospital parking lot. If I'm really pregnant now, can't I go back and get married immediately? The sooner I marry into the Li family, when I return to the base, I won't just be little Feng Ling in the eyes of those grandsons. She'll be Mrs. Li, my wife. As the man spoke, he leaned down to her ear. Why don't we go back tonight and make a baby? Feng Ling originally thought that she was really pregnant last night, but now she knew that it was just a misunderstanding. It was just an upset stomach. She couldn't tell if she was relaxed or a little regretful like him. Their relationship was so good. In fact, if they really had children, it would be good. Anyway, as he said, if she had time to take care of the children, she could learn to be a mother. If she really didn't have time, the elders of the Li family could help them take care of the children. This was indeed a happy thing. Hearing that he wanted to make a baby, she did not say anything. She did not object or agree. Seeing that she clearly did not completely reject him, Li Nanheng's eyes lit up. He wished he could bring her back to the car and make a baby in the car. However, after being kissed by him for a while in the car, Feng Ling suddenly said, "Since it's rare for you to come out, buy some blankets and coats nearby. After all, you have to stay here for the entire winter. Buy a duvet. It's light and comfortable." Sure. Li Nanheng's mind was filled with thoughts of going home to make a baby. It was even better to change to a more comfortable quilt. Without hesitation, he agreed and hugged her to nibble on it. When Feng Ling raised her hand to push his face, he smiled and drove to the nearby shopping mall. After all, this was a scenic spot. There was no lack of anything. The shopping mall was also very close. It had been a long time since Feng Ling had visited such a place. After buying the duvet, she strolled around for a while and bought some other daily necessities. She also bought a particularly beautiful shell wind chime that was commonly seen in this kind of scenic spot with the sea. Feng Ling and wind chime had the same sound. She instinctively liked this thing and bought it. She wanted to hang it in front of the window of the cabin as a decoration. Of course, there was no lack of delicacies from all over the world in this kind of scenic spot. There was a hot pot place on the top floor of the shopping mall. Although the taste was not as authentic as the last time, the soup base was light, and the ingredients were enough to satisfy one's cravings. Furthermore, it was not very stimulating to the stomach. After buying a lot of things and eating their fill, they prepared to go back. The two of them had just placed the things they had bought into the trunk of the car and were tidying up the things in the back of the car when they suddenly heard some tourists nearby speaking different languages and pointing in a certain direction. Their words were filled with surprise and bewilderment. Li Nanheng seemed to understand a certain Korean or Japanese language spoken by the people closest to him. His hand that was putting the things into the car suddenly paused, and he abruptly turned to look in the direction those people were pointing at. In the distance, the sea was calm, and about 10 kilometers away, in the direction of the jungle where he had accompanied Feng Ling for half a year, there was billowing smoke in the sky. The smell had even gradually drifted to this position, and the air was filled with the smell of burning fire. At this moment, Feng Ling also abruptly turned to look in that direction. Her clear eyes reflected the thick black smoke, and her brows instantly twitched. She abruptly turned to look at Li Nanheng. Without saying anything, the two of them decisively closed the trunk, quickly got into the car, and drove back. The closer they got to the jungle, the more they could feel the burning sensation in the air. When they could clearly see the flames, Li Nanheng frowned. He didn't need to look at Feng Ling's eyes to know her current mood. The flames had already covered the entire jungle. It was early winter, and the air was dry. The trees in the jungle had already turned yellow. As long as there was a little fire source, with the help of the wind, it was enough to make the fire spread very quickly. When they drove the car to a place only a few hundred meters away from the flames, the sea of flames had almost engulfed the entire jungle. He didn't have time to think about their home, their house, and everything they had left in the jungle. Li Nanheng only heard the sound of many fire engines approaching. At the same time, he saw the black MPV parked not far away. When he saw the old couple standing by the car and excitedly wanting to rush into the sea of fire, his brows suddenly twitched. The two elders of the Feng family? They. Feng Ling stared at the sea of flames and followed Li Nanheng's gaze blankly to the two old men who were rushing in the direction of the sea of flames. Her voice was slightly hoarse. Who are they? Grandfather Feng and Grandmother Feng. When Li Nanheng said these words, he seemed to have thought of something. He subconsciously gripped the steering wheel tightly and drove the car over. When the car stopped by the two elders, she had just opened the door when she suddenly heard Grandmother Feng's desperate and pained cry. What should we do? What should we do? They're all inside, they're inside. How can there be such a big fire? What should we do? Inside. Who is inside? Li Nanheng got out of the car, and Feng Ling quickly followed him out. When she followed him to the two elders of the Feng family, the two agitated old men suddenly turned their eyes. When they recognized Li Nanheng, they abruptly turned their heads and met Feng Ling's eyes. Chapter 1255. The moment their eyes met, the two old men looked into Feng Ling's eyes and were both startled. Grandmother Feng looked at her with tears in her eyes. She raised her hand tremblingly, but as she looked at her, she anxiously reached out in the direction of the burning jungle. This child, this. Elders, this is. Li Nanheng sensed the seriousness of the matter from the two elders' eyes and frowned. What happened? Grandfather Feng's gaze also fell on Feng Ling, but he didn't have time to say anything. The moment he saw Li Nanheng, he raised his old hand and pointed in the direction of the fire. They're inside. They went in to look for you. Quick, think of a way to save them. Li Nanheng's brows twitched. Who are they? At this moment, Grandmother Feng suddenly burst into tears. She quickly stepped forward and hugged Feng Ling, who was still standing by the side in a daze. As she hugged her, she buried her face in front of her and cried loudly. My granddaughter. You're my granddaughter. Feng Ling. My good granddaughter. Grandma finally saw you. But what should we do now? Your parents went in just now. They thought you were in the jungle, and were afraid that our legs wouldn't be good. So they said they would go in to look for you first. But why did it suddenly catch fire? What should we do now? Old Madame Feng cried and sobbed. As she cried, Li Nanheng could roughly understand what was going on. Suddenly learning that Qin Qiu and Mr. Feng were in the jungle, Li Nanheng's eyes darkened. He glanced at Feng Ling, who was still standing there. She didn't know where to put her hands and feet when she saw the old woman suddenly pouncing on her and crying uncontrollably. However, the moment she heard that her biological parents were in the burning jungle, all her hair stood on end. The moment Li Nanheng turned to look at her, she abruptly turned to look at him. Their eyes met. They were used to being in 11 base, so they didn't have anything else to say. The most important thing right now was to save them. How did they get in with such a big fire? Li Nanheng said as he quickly observed the fire above the jungle. Hearing the sound of the fire engines approaching, he turned back to look in the direction of the fire engines and decisively walked toward them. Feng Ling thought that Qin Qiu was inside. That was her mother and her father whom she had never seen before. The habit of every rescue mission, and the faint consciousness in her heart, reminded her to immediately go to the fire engine, with Li Nanheng to apply for the rescue. However, the old woman who was crying so hard that she almost fainted made her unable to retreat. Her hands were stiff by her sides. Listening to the old woman's pained and anxious cries, Feng Ling lowered her head to look at her. Her lips moved, but she didn't know what to say or what to say. At the critical moment of life and death, no one could spare the extra thought to consider what kind of background or how to address them. She paused for a moment and looked up at the old man who was walking over. Old Mr. Feng, I'm sorry, but I have to participate in the rescue now. Let's save them first, okay? Elder Feng looked at her deeply and tried his best to suppress his anxiety. He nodded at her and said, How are you going to save such a big fire? Child, don't take the risk. Your parents are in danger now. If you go in and something happens to them, I'm a member of 11 Base. I have professional rescue methods. I've participated in countless dangerous missions. Please trust us. With that, Feng Ling pushed the crying old woman in her arms to Elder Feng. At the same time, she quickly turned and ran in the direction of the fire engine. Grandfather Feng held his wife's hand tightly and looked back at the burning jungle worriedly. The weather was too dry, and the fire was getting bigger and bigger. It was easier said than done to save people in such a large jungle. On the one hand, he was filled with worry, and on the other hand, he was happy to finally see Feng Ling. The two feelings collided. The two old men couldn't bear it and staggered by the car door. Please be all right. Please. Grandmother Feng clutched her chest, her eyes red. From time to time, she looked at the flames in the sky, and then turned to look in the direction Feng Ling had just left. As she looked, she said in a trembling voice, Old man, that's our granddaughter. Yes, she's our granddaughter. Grandfather Feng sighed. With just a glance, I can tell that she's an outstanding and brave child. Several fire engines were already in place. Li Nanheng used his phone to contact the nearest rescue helicopter of 11 Base. It would fly over in about half an hour. Because they were really members of 11 Base, the rescue team had to take out spare fireproof suits, disinfectant masks, and other equipment in the car at their request. Li Nanheng communicated with the people in the fire truck in English the whole time. Feng Ling listened and quickly changed her clothes. Although she was silent and did not step forward to speak, although she looked calm, her trembling hands still exposed the worry and fear under her emotions. It was really too difficult to save the two of them in such a big fire. But the people there were her parents. And the two kind old men just now were her grandparents. They were all family members that she had never dared to hope for. Why did the fire suddenly break out? Why did they suddenly come here? Why did they go in? How could this be? After Li Nanheng communicated with the people inside, he turned back and saw Feng Ling fastening her belt with trembling hands. His gaze fell on her face. At this time, any words of concern were useless. He only looked at her and asked in a serious and low voice, "Can you do it?" Feng Ling did not answer. Instead, she decisively picked up the gas mask and put it on her head as an answer. The fire in the jungle was very big. Although Li Nanheng didn't want Feng Ling to take the risk, she had been on many rescue missions, and they were more dangerous than this. Right now, the people inside were her parents, and she couldn't be left outside. She had to go with them. After you go in, listen to my commands. No matter what happens, no matter what situation you see, don't be emotional. Li Nanheng warned in a low voice that only she could hear. Feng Ling had already put on the gas mask and looked up at him. Okay. The sky was dyed red by the flames, and the scorching heat came from the direction of the jungle, making her eyelids hurt. No one would have thought that the forest would be engulfed by a sea of fire just a moment ago, when they were still planning to return to the forest and change into a feather quilt to stay for another winter. Chapter 1256. The sudden impact on Li Nanheng was not small, let alone Feng Ling, who had a special feeling for this jungle. However, the people in danger were her parents who gave birth to her. She didn't even have the time to feel sad or regretful. She had to participate in the rescue. She couldn't even have the time to feel uneasy or confused. Li Nanheng looked at her for 2 more seconds and suddenly said sternly, "Feng Ling, listen up." Feng Ling, whose back was slightly sagging, subconsciously straightened her body and stood in front of him with her legs closed. "Yes. From now on, follow behind me. You're not allowed to rush forward alone. You're not allowed to be more than a meter away from me. Even if the home you built with your own hands is destroyed, you have to remember what's more important. If the home is gone, you can build it again. Your life is the most important, understand?" Feng Ling's expression did not change. Her hands slowly clenched into fists in the sleeves of her heat-resistant suit. Although she only answered with one word, her voice was still hoarse. "Yes." At the same time, the 2 elders of the Feng family were quickly invited over by the firefighters to ask what had happened. As the people in the car were all wearing the same clothes and the same disinfectant mask, their faces could not be seen. The only thing the 2 elders could recognize was Feng Ling, who was slightly shorter and thinner than those men. When she answered all the questions, she stared at her and said with red eyes, "My son and daughter-in-law are here to look for their long-lost child." As she spoke, the old lady looked at Feng Ling's mask and stared at her. "We all thought that the child had been inside and wanted to pick her up and let her go home. But the jungle was too big. They didn't come out for more than 2 hours, and there was no signal on the phone. Then, for some reason, a fire suddenly broke out. The wind was too strong, and the fire spread very quickly. My old man and I were afraid that something would happen, so we quickly called the police. It didn't take long for the fire engine to arrive, but the fire was already terrifyingly big. After learning the general cause and effect, the fire brigade arranged for all the rescue and fire prevention equipment. If it was just a forest fire, there was no way to control the fire rationally. They could only wait for the fire to gradually become smaller and control the periphery to not be burned. After understanding the general cause and effect of the fire brigade immediately arranged for all rescue and fire prevention equipment. If it was just a forest fire, the fire could not be controlled rationally at all. They could only wait for the fire to gradually become smaller and control the periphery so that the fire would not spread to more places. But now that there were people in the jungle, they had no choice but to take the risk to rush in to save them. In such an endless jungle, they had no idea where the two of them were. In such a sea of fire, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack, and they were risking their lives to fish for it. Feng Ling jumped out of the fire truck with everyone. Old Madame Feng watched her figure with reddened eyes. Seeing that Feng Ling did not look back and decisively followed everyone forward, Old Madame Feng suddenly called her, "Child." Feng Ling's footsteps paused, but she only paused for a moment before continuing. "Feng Ling." Madame Feng couldn't help but rush forward to grab her wrist. "Good child, do you know your background? Do you know what your relationship with the Feng family is? Listen to Grandma. Don't go, okay? You've already suffered for too many years. Don't go." Feng Ling was silent for a moment before gently pulling her hand out of the old lady's grasp. She then turned back and said through the gas mask, "I'll save them. Please don't worry." With that she left. "Ah, child Feng Ling." Madame Feng was about to chase after her, but Feng Ling had already walked far away. Behind her, several members of the fire truck came forward to support Madame Feng, who was almost unable to stand steadily. They politely sent her and Grandfather Feng into the car and let them rest for the time being. Rest? Who could really rest? Grandfather Feng held his wife's hand tightly and looked at the sea of fire. He hated that he was too old. If time could turn back 30 or 40 years, they would definitely rush in to save him. They wouldn't be sitting here crying and being taken care of. There was nothing else they could do. In the end, Madame Feng could only close her eyes anxiously and pray to the heavens, to the Bodhisattva, and to the various gods. In the jungle, no one was more familiar with the environment than Feng Ling. The flames engulfed everything, and the flames and thick smoke also obscured the vision of the road ahead. Feng Ling followed the route in her memory. In addition, Li Nanheng had lived here for half a year, so he was already familiar with many directions and routes. The two of them carried rescue equipment and rushed in first. They stepped on the ground that was barely visible under the flames and leaned forward. The thick smoke was too heavy for them to speak, and the mask on their faces was not suitable for them to speak either. Li Nanheng searched around with the help of the flames. At the same time, his gaze fell on Feng Ling from time to time. He saw that she had been following obediently the entire time, and was not too emotional because of worry, but he knew that this was when she was really worried and flustered. The more expressionless she was, the more emotional she was. She was afraid. She was not afraid that something would happen to her. She was afraid that her mother would really die here. This was the place where she could save her life when she was young. She had spent 5 years growing up here. If something happened to her parents here, how would she face all of this in the future? Li Nanheng lowered his head and glanced at the slightly soft mud. He saw 2 pairs of uneven footprints on it. Looking in the direction of the footprints, he pursed his thin lips coldly. Without saying a word, he reached out and pulled Feng Ling to his side. He pulled her forward and silently gave her the courage to persevere. Feng Ling's hand pressed against his hand and did not say anything. Feng Ling pressed her hand against his and did not say anything. She also saw the 2 footprints and guessed that they should be her parents. She immediately clenched her hand in his hand, but after a short while, the man forced her hand open and held it in his palm, preventing her from suppressing her emotions and stabbing herself with her nails. At the same time, he held her firmly and kept her by his side, not giving her any chance to take risks alone. Even if she died here, she had to die by Li Nanheng's side. The two of them bent down and continued to walk in, but the deeper they went, the more the smoke choked their eyes. Even though the gas and fire masks were very effective, they still inhaled some. The rescue operations that Feng Ling had participated in before were not as large as the jungle, and she could accurately know the target location. Chapter 1257. Right now they didn't even know where they were. How could they find a target location? In such a large jungle, they could hide in any corner. But in such a sea of fire, where could they hide? The two of them gradually separated from the firefighters and kept walking forward because their home was there. The road in the middle of the jungle was particularly rugged. It was so rugged that even though they had walked it for half a year, they still felt scared when they stepped on it again. The sea of fire spread, and the choking smoke was nearby. A cluster of fire lifted her clothes. Although the fireproof suit would not burn, it was really hot. Can we still hold on? No matter how they walked in, they were still very far away from their usual living area. The fire was too big. It was not practical to walk in that direction with such a big fire. They would definitely die here before they reached their destination. Feng Ling nodded hastily and did not say much. Li Nanheng exerted a little force and forced Feng Lin to stop. At the same time, he turned around to block her. He lowered his head and saw that the little woman did not seem to realize that she had stopped. She was still walking forward mechanically. She only had to stop because she bumped into his arms. Focus. Don't think about unrelated things. The house can be built again. Let's change the route. They don't know where we built the house. Under normal circumstances, which direction will people go first when they enter the jungle for the first time? Which side looks more obvious? I remember there's a small path near that side. Li Nanheng pressed her into his arms, coaxing her while trying to distract her. Feng Ling came back to herself. She had come in to find Qin Xiu and the others. Of course, saving them was more important. However, after walking in and watching the jungle gradually being swallowed by the sea of fire, she subconsciously wanted to go back and take a look. She didn't know what the emotions in her heart were, but her trembling heart was because when she looked at the trees that were swallowed by the fire, she thought of the home she and Li Nanheng lived together, the home he helped her build bit by bit. She was very sad, but it was not the time to be sad. She braced herself and nodded, trying to sound as calm as possible. Yes, there's a high possibility that the road over there is the same. If they were Feng Ling's parents, and this was the first time they had come to a place like the jungle, and learned that it was impossible to drive inside. But they also knew that Feng Ling seemed to live here. What would they do? Of course, after walking in, he would find the path that looked the most like a road. Then, he would continue to search for every place that looked beautiful and safe, connecting one safe direction after another. Li Nanheng decisively led Feng Ling there. He no longer hesitated or searched around randomly. He took the same path back and walked toward the route he had roughly guessed. In this thick smoke and terrifying sea of fire, he finally saw the unconscious Mr. Feng Yuancheng, under a tree. Finally she saw someone. When Feng Ling saw the person who had fallen to the ground, she thought it was Qin Xiu. She endured the scorching heat and the sweat on her body and rushed over. In the end, she turned the person over and saw that it was a man. She had rushed over in a hurry and hadn't seen his silhouette clearly. When she saw that it was a man, she paused. At this moment, Li Nanheng walked over and whispered, "Since Mr. Feng is here, it means that Madame Feng should be nearby. The husband and wife should avoid the fire and walk around here. They won't be too far apart." Hearing that this person was Mr. Feng Ling composed herself and glanced at the middle-aged man, who had fainted from the thick smoke on the ground. Li Nanheng stepped forward and helped the man up. He grabbed one of the man's hands and placed it on his shoulder, helping him to stand up. However, Mr. Feng had clearly fallen into a deep coma and was unconscious. He did not notice this little movement at all. He did not even have the slightest reaction. Li Nanheng knew very well that they were surrounded by trees. It was easy to ignite and produce a lot of thick smoke. He and Feng Ling, wearing heat-resistant suits and gas masks, were already very uncomfortable after coming in for less than 10 minutes, not to mention how much smoke Mr. Feng and Madame Feng had inhaled. Usually in a fire, the fire was not fatal. The smoke was the real source of death. After Feng Ling finally found one of them, her mental state improved slightly. However, because the smoke here was too thick, she did not have any hope of seeing if Madame Feng could make it out alive. Based on the situation here, any rational person would be able to guess that even if the two of them were brought out, there was almost no hope of them surviving. She quickly looked around. The thick smoke affected her vision. Feng Ling narrowed her eyes and walked a little faster. She continued forward until she saw Madame Feng, Qin Xiu, who had fallen under the tree about 10 meters away. Her heart pounded hard, and she quickly ran over to help Qin Xiu up. Madame Feng and Mr. Feng were in the same situation. They were unconscious. Time could not be delayed any longer. Feng Ling did not hesitate to carry Qin Xiu on her back. She supported her body with one hand, and decisively took off the mask on her face with the other. She was about to put it on Qin Xiu's face. Li Nanheng turned back and saw her action. His cold brows furrowed. "Do you want to die?" Feng Ling did not answer. She just glanced at him, and did not speak. She carried him on her back and walked out. Li Nanheng saw that she was feeling uncomfortable, and guessed that nothing he said would make sense, so he did not stop her from doing such a stupid thing. Instead, he raised his hand to take off the mask on his face, and walked over to put it on for her. When Feng Ling looked up at him, and wanted to ask him what to do, she saw the anger in the man's eyes and was speechless. "Don't waste time. Let's go," Li Nanheng ordered coldly. He carried the middle-aged man who had been leaning weakly by his side, and quickly carried him out with Feng Ling. They rushed out along the road under the sea of fire. From time to time, there was the sound of a tree being burned and falling. The journey that should have taken more than 10 minutes was completed in 5 minutes. They had been in there for so long that 11 Base's rescue helicopter had already arrived. Ignoring the objections of the firefighters, they were about to rush in to find them. A group of people was in a stalemate outside the jungle. Suddenly, they saw 2 people rushing out of the sea, each carrying a person. Seeing the 2 figures rushing out under the flames, the members of 11 Base were used to this kind of scene. They were the first to react, and hurriedly went up to help. The firefighters looked at the 2 people who rushed out in shock and disbelief. Then they looked at the entire jungle that had been burned and felt incredulous. Chapter 1258. Feng Ling carried Qin Xiu on her back and ran out. The moment the rescue team of 11 Base rushed over, she saw that it was her own people. Her legs turned to jelly, and she staggered, almost kneeling on the ground. The rescue team members stepped forward to support her. Feng Ling. They hadn't seen each other for several months, but they didn't ask much. They just helped her up, and quickly took the unconscious Qin Xiu over. "The smoke inside is so heavy. Why did you and boss take off the things on your heads?" "It's okay." Just now Li Nanheng had put it on for her, but she was in a hurry and didn't put it on properly. She still inhaled some smoke. She gasped uncomfortably and glanced at them. Then she looked at Qin Xiu, who had been quickly helped into the helicopter. She turned around and saw that Mr. Feng had also been sent into the helicopter by Li Nanheng. The firefighters also rushed over to cooperate. After confirming that there was no one else in the jungle, they began to carry out the emergency rescue work. However, the fire was too big. It was not easy to put out the fire. This matter was not under the control of 11 Base. Right now the most important thing was to save lives. After receiving Boss Li's instructions, the members of 11 Base directly brought the 2 elders in the fire truck to another helicopter, and drove the helicopter to the hospital without delay. Feng Ling boarded Li Nanheng's helicopter. Mrs. Feng and Mr. Feng were unconscious in the helicopter. Their faces were in a mess. She didn't dare to check their breathing, but when she carried Qin Xiu out, she didn't seem to feel Qin Xiu's breath. It was so thick smoke. This kind of situation was not something that could be explained by external or internal injuries. In such a big fire, with such thick smoke, even a short 5 minutes was enough to be fatal. When she carried him out, she tried her best to adjust her breathing rate so that she would not choke on the smoke. But at this moment, she felt that her lungs were hurting terribly, and her throat felt like it was being pricked by countless needles. If it was just a bloody wound, everything would be fine. If they were pushed into the emergency room, there might be a good chance of survival. But in this situation, seeing the couple lying there silently and the base doctor opening their eyelids to check their condition, and seeing the base doctor frowning, her heart sank to the bottom. Her hands suddenly felt heavy. Li Nanheng had already taken off his heat insulation suit, sat beside her, and held her hand tightly and heavily. Don't worry. The man's throat was also a little hoarse, but it was clear that he was in a much better state than her. He looked at her with heartache and worry in his eyes. And the other half was because he had to take charge of the overall situation for her under such circumstances. Feng Ling didn't say anything. She didn't know how pale her face was right now. She had some gastrointestinal problems since last night. Although the nausea and vomiting were gone, the discomfort in her stomach still existed. After such a stimulation and torment, she felt as though her entire stomach had turned over. Looking at Qin Xiu and Mr. Feng lying there motionless and silent, her heart also turned over. It was as though her internal organs were hurting. However, in the end, she didn't say anything. She unzipped her heat insulation suit with one hand and let out a long breath. She took off the heat insulation suit that had completely wrapped around her and threw it to the side. Her shoulder-length hair was wet with sweat and stuck to her cheeks and neck. Her body was also covered in sweat. She didn't know if she saw wrongly or if there was an airflow, but the plane was a little bumpy. She seemed to vaguely see the base doctor shaking his head gently after the examination. His eyes were filled with helplessness. Feng Ling's gaze swept past the base doctor's face and then landed on the couple. Her hands were almost instantly cold. Li Nanheng held her tightly and raised his hand to hold her in his arms. They're all fine here. Don't worry, they'll be fine. If you feel uncomfortable, close your eyes for a while. When we arrive at the hospital, we'll send them to the emergency room immediately. Don't be afraid. Feng Ling closed her eyes and leaned into his arms. In the end, she allowed the discomfort and exhaustion to surround her. Her lips moved. Her voice was too hoarse and low. It's all my fault. Blame you for what? When Li Nanheng heard these words, he instantly frowned and gripped her shoulder tightly. Don't let your imagination run wild. What does this have to do with you? In fact, we should have left long ago. I was the one who couldn't bear to leave. There were clearly so many responsibilities waiting for us. But I hid in a secluded world and selfishly enjoyed so many stolen days. If I could go back earlier, perhaps they wouldn't come looking for me. Perhaps they wouldn't. Feng Ling, Li Nanheng held her firmly in his arms. You know very well that this kind of thing has nothing to do with you. Don't rush to take the blame when something happens. The cause of the fire is still unclear. It's still unclear what happened to Mr. Feng and Mrs. Feng after they entered the jungle. If you continue to be so negative, I'm afraid I'll bring you back to the base. I won't even let you go to the hospital. You won't be able to see the Feng family again. Feng Ling did not speak anymore. She just closed her eyes and leaned weakly in his arms. After a long time, just when Li Nanheng thought that she was so tired that she fell asleep in his arms, he suddenly heard a low sob. Feng Ling was crying. However, she was afraid that someone would find out that she was crying, so she could only hide in his arms, but she still couldn't help but make a little sound. Li Nanheng did not speak. He hugged her and gently stroked the back of her head, as though he was coaxing an injured little beast. He lowered his head and kissed the hair on her head to comfort her. At the same time, he turned to look at the doctor. The doctor saw that Feng Ling did not look at them, and turned to meet Li Nanheng's gaze. He sighed imperceptibly, and then gently shook his head. There was nothing he could do. The cabin was very quiet, and no one spoke. If one listened carefully, they could only vaguely hear Feng Ling's low sobs. But she really tried her best to suppress it and hide her voice. Her face was buried in his arms, and her hands were also tightly gripping his clothes. Her fingers were still tightly clenched, and there was the sound of bones crisscrossing. In all these years, the number of times Feng Ling had cried could be counted with 5 fingers, not to mention in front of so many members of the base. Li Nanheng glanced at the couple again, and his eyes darkened. He abruptly picked up Feng Ling, who was sobbing softly in his arms, and carried her into the bathroom in the helicopter. Chapter 1259. In the bathroom on the helicopter, there were all the things and facilities. The space was not big, but it was very quiet. After closing the door, It could isolate all the gazes from the outside. He gave her a quiet space to cry and let her vent. However, after entering the bathroom, Feng Ling just stuck in his arms and refused to raise her head. Li Nanheng locked the bathroom door, pressed her against the door, lowered his eyes to look at her, and forced her chin up to stare at her red eyes. Don't hide. If your heart is too uncomfortable, cry. After all, we've already rescued her, haven't we? The damage has been minimized, and the rest will be left to the doctor. You didn't do anything wrong. That jungle was the place where you lived when you were very, very young. You should be glad that your parents wanted to come here personally to take you back. They have seen the place where you lived when you were young. They really love you and miss you very much. Feng Ling could no longer hold back her tears. She raised her red eyes to look at him and suddenly burst into tears. She threw herself into the man's arms and sobbed hoarsely. Li Nanheng, I'm afraid. From the first day she could remember, she stood in the jungle to survive, and then for so many years, until today. This was the first time she said she was afraid. Li Nanheng hugged her and let her cry to her heart's content in the bathroom. In the end, when she was tired of crying and her stomach was uncomfortable, she leaned weakly in his arms and did not make a sound. After confirming that she had stopped crying, he opened the bathroom door and let her out. At this time, the helicopter had already flown over a large hospital that cooperated with 11 Base and was about to land. Feng Ling's eyes were already red from crying. The base members on the plane saw that she was actually crying. Recalling the scene where Feng Ling and Boss Li risked their lives to save her from the sea of fire, although they didn't know what relationship the Feng family had with them, their relationship shouldn't be simple. Considering that Feng Ling was also surnamed Feng, the base members didn't dare to ask more. However, after the plane landed, considering that the wind outside was too strong and Feng Ling's eyes were rarely so red, one of the members handed her a pair of sunglasses. Thank you, I don't need it. Feng Ling didn't mind her eyes were red. Put it on. The wind is strong. You just cried, and your eyes can't stand the stimulation. Li Nanheng took it for her and put the sunglasses on for her. He really couldn't bear to see her crying. Earlier in the bathroom, his heart ached so much that he wanted to dig out his heart. Right now, there were still a lot of things waiting for them to deal with outside. There were also Mrs. Feng and Mr. Feng's lives waiting for emergency treatment. He needed to calm down and rationally deal with it, but as long as he saw her swollen eyes from crying, he was afraid he wouldn't be able to remain 100% calm. Feng Ling did not resist. She thought of the two elders of the Feng family in the other helicopter. At this time, they must be more worried. If they saw her crying like this, the two elders would probably not be able to control their emotions. The old man was old and could not take too much stimulation. The plane landed smoothly. The base members quickly sent Mr. Feng and Mrs. Feng to the hospital emergency center. Feng Ling got off the plane and was about to follow them when she suddenly heard the door of another plane that had just landed open. Someone was reminding the two elders of the Feng family to be careful not to fall. She stopped in her tracks and turned back to see the two elders. She saw that they were trembling and eager to get off the plane. Li Nanheng was going to the emergency center to dispatch people. There were many things he needed to do. He patted Feng Ling's shoulder. Go accompany the two elders first. Leave the rest to me. I'll investigate the cause of the fire as soon as possible. Be obedient and go. Feng Ling stood in place. Seeing that Li Nanheng had already entered the emergency center, she gently exhaled, then turned to the helicopter and went up to help. Grandfather Feng and Grandmother Feng were as anxious as ants on a hot pan. They were anxious to enter the emergency center to check on the situation. When she suddenly saw Feng Ling, Grandmother Feng's tears, which she had held back all the way, fell again. When Feng Ling reached out to support her, she quickly grabbed her hand tightly. Feng Ling, my good granddaughter. There was no need for a blood test or any other verification. When she saw her outside the jungle, she was sure that this was really that child. The pitiful child of the Feng family, who had been lost in the vast ocean at the age of 1. She doted on her the most. Feng Ling's face was somewhat similar to Qin Qiu's, but her features were very similar to her father's. Her entire body was filled with the shadow of the Feng family. It couldn't be wrong. In the eyes of outsiders, she still looked cold and unapproachable. However, after her hand was tightly grabbed by the old lady, she did not move away. She only supported her and nodded at Grandfather Feng, who was walking over. She said softly to them, "I've already sent him to the emergency room. I'll accompany you to the emergency center to find a rest room. Earlier, I choked on a lot of smoke and was tossed around all the way. Even young people can't take it, let alone you too. Go rest first. We'll be here. Don't worry." Grandfather Feng nodded and said softly, "I've already sent him to the emergency room." Grandmother Feng cried and nodded. "Child, you know who we are, don't you? You know where you're. Let's wait for news from the emergency room." Although Feng Ling knew that they were her family, and that the people in front of her loved and missed her grandparents, now was not the time to acknowledge them. Besides, she didn't know how to deal with such feelings. She interrupted her softly. Her sunglasses covered all the true emotions in her eyes. She only called the members of the base in the helicopter to help her help the two elders of the Feng family in. Even though Feng Ling looked indifferent and unapproachable, at least she did not let go of Grandmother Feng's hand. When she sent them to the rest room, she said that she would pour them 2 glasses of water. Grandmother Feng could see that her entire body was tense. Even though she was reluctant, she still let go of her hand. Feng Ling asked someone to accompany them here. She then turned around and went out. She found 2 disposable cups to fill with warm water. When she returned with the water, she was still thinking about the jungle that had been swallowed by the sea of fire. The home she and Li Nanheng had built with their own hands would definitely not be able to return. Thankfully, all the memories were warm and happy. Thankfully, neither of them was injured. As he said, the home could be rebuilt if it was destroyed. Life was more important. So how did the fire start? She remembered that before she left, she had extinguished all the fire sources. She was afraid that it would cause a fire in the jungle. Fire prevention was very important. She had been very careful, so it was impossible for it to have spontaneously ignited from the inside. There must be some external factor. Chapter 1260. But what kind of external factors was it? There was no one nearby, and there were signs prohibiting tourists from approaching. She knew that there was no one to control the jungle, and that it was not safe, so no one dared to go near it. It had caused such a serious fire so quickly. She had every reason to suspect that someone had set the fire on purpose. But there weren't even any surveillance cameras nearby. Walking back to the lounge, Feng Ling put down the 2 glasses of water. In fact, she didn't know how to comfort the old couple, but they had clearly been through a lot. At first, their emotions were indeed unstable, anxious, and excited, but now they had calmed down. Grandfather Feng sat on the chair in the lounge and sighed softly. From time to time, he asked the base members who were guarding them. He was concerned about the situation in the emergency room, and wanted to know how serious the discipline of his son and daughter-in-law was. The base members didn't know this probability. They only knew that the survival rate was very low. At this time, they couldn't be provoked, so they could only answer that they didn't know. Old Madame Feng sat there, her eyes still red. When she saw Feng Ling return, she turned to look at her. When Feng Ling went to fetch the water, she turned on the tap and washed her face and eyes with cold water. Although her eyes were still slightly swollen, it was not too obvious. She had already taken off her sunglasses. Meeting old Madame Feng's gaze, she gently placed the disposable paper cup filled with warm water in her hand. "Drink some water first. Calm down." Old Madame Feng looked at her with mixed emotions. She wanted to say something. The whole family drove to the jungle because they heard that Feng Ling seemed to have lived there when she was young. When she heard this news, her heart ached uncontrollably. She really wanted to bring the child back to dote on her, but she didn't expect to encounter such a thing. Right now, she was looking at such a living granddaughter standing in front of her. Her features were delicate, and her personality was steady and dignified. Even though she did not receive higher education from the Feng family, she was clearly a very outstanding and sensible child. She was many times more mature than those spoiled rich young ladies raised in wealthy families. She clearly had a lot to say, but when she saw her, she couldn't say a word. She held the cup in one hand and held Feng Ling's hand with the other, unwilling to let go. She said warmly, "Child, the Feng family has let you down." Feng Ling was startled for a moment. She then smiled lightly at the old lady. "No, now is not the time to talk about this. Please relax." Seeing that she was so sensible, old Madame Feng felt even worse. She put down the cup and held her hand. "Can you let me hug you well? Grandma, just want to hug you. I know you're worried about your parents. You look sensible. Your grandfather and I are also worried about them. But you're the child we've lost for 20 years. Right now, I just want to hug you properly." Feng Ling stood by her side and didn't speak. She looked at her with a pained expression. Grandma, just want to hug you." Feng Ling looked at her and nodded slightly. Old Madame Feng instantly choked up. She resisted the urge to cry and hugged Feng Ling. Although old Madame Feng was old, she was a very famous model in the American Chinese world when she was young. Her height shrank as she grew older, but she was not short. In front of Feng Ling, she could hold the thin Feng Ling in her arms and hug her like an elder protecting a child. In her 21 years of life, this was the first time she felt the embrace of a family member. And it was her own grandmother. Feng Ling had never resisted the Feng family, but she was not used to it. She didn't know how to face those people who were related to her by blood, so she didn't want to acknowledge them. However, at this moment, being hugged so tightly by her grandmother, a great sadness finally surrounded her. It was as though she was a child who was aggrieved and wanted to cry in her grandmother's arms. Her nose turned sour, but she held it in. She obediently allowed her to hug her. Hearing that Grandfather Feng was also walking over agitatedly, she did not push him away. "Child, you've been wronged." Grandfather Feng stood by the side and wanted to hug her, but seeing that his wife was reluctant to let go, he could only stand by the side and smile in relief. If it weren't for the fact that his son and daughter-in-law were still in the emergency room, his laughter would have been even brighter. He looked at Feng Ling. "How exactly did you live in that jungle? We've asked many people, but not many people know what you've experienced. Even if we know, we only know a little, but just that little is enough to make our hearts ache. You've really suffered too much. In the future, come back to the Feng family with us. We'll definitely do our best to make up for everything you've lost in the past 20 years. We love you very much and miss you very much. You're our Feng family's flesh and blood, our little granddaughter." Grandfather Feng stood by the side and wanted to hug her, but seeing that his wife was reluctant to let go, he could only stand by the side and smile in relief. Perhaps it was because she had just let go of her emotions and cried in front of Li Nanheng, so the defenses in her heart were not so heavy. Or perhaps it was because her grandparents' true feelings touched her. Feng Ling couldn't hold back her sour nose and tears fell out. She didn't like to cry. She had never thought that people would really cry when they were emotionally touched. She had only told Li Nanheng about her experiences in her life. At that time, she did not say it in detail, but Li Nanheng could tell what her childhood was like from her life and habits. He had even accompanied her to live in the jungle for so long. In this world, it was enough for only Li Nanheng to know her experiences. She didn't want to be the kind of person who would show others the wounds that had long healed. So she didn't follow Grandfather Feng's words. Instead, she raised her hand and gently patted Grandmother Feng's back. She said softly, "I'm right here. I won't be lost again. You two should rest well." Grandfather Feng's eyes instantly turned red when he heard the words "won't be lost again." Grandmother Feng hugged her even tighter. At this moment, there was the sound of the base members greeting him respectfully. Then Li Nanheng appeared in front of the lounge. The man's gaze was solemn and indifferent as he looked at the two elders of the Feng family. He nodded politely at Grandfather Feng and glanced at the figure being held by the old lady. His voice was so serious that it made Feng Ling shiver. "Feng Ling, come out." Feng Ling patted the old lady's back again. She turned around and saw the man's solemn expression. Ching Ching has finally opened a reader group after more than a year of cheering from the readers. Ha ha ha, and it's a WeChat group. If you want to join, go take a look on Weibo and send me a private message to take a screenshot of my fan value. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.